The Ark Orbiter has been sitting in low orbit above every single match of Ark Raiders since early access launched, and most players treat it as a round timer that's on fire. But the lore buried in what this machine actually is, where it comes from, and what it represents within the Ark invasion is genuinely one of the most unsettling threads in the entire game. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I made this video because I noticed that almost every discussion about the orbiter lives in the strategy space. People talk about when it fires, where debris lands, and how to time your extraction around it. That is completely reasonable, but it meant that the lore angle was basically untouched. I went through every in-game fragment, every survivor document, every piece of environmental detail the game offers, and tried to assemble a picture of what this orbital platform actually is within the fiction of Ark Raiders. One specific choice I made when putting this together was to treat the orbiter as the lens through which we understand the Ark machine hierarchy as a whole. Instead of covering every Ark unit type first and arriving at the orbiter later, I reversed that. We start with the orbiter and work outward. That structure felt more honest to how the game actually presents it, which is as something ancient and overwhelming that you never fully understand. Everything else the game tells you about the Ark machines gets clearer when you hold it up against what the orbiter represents. Chapter 1. The Day the Sky Became a Weapon. To understand what the Ark Orbiter is, you first have to understand what the world of Ark Raiders looked like before it arrived. The game does not give you a clean timeline. It does not hand you a history textbook or a news broadcast explaining what happened. What it gives you instead are fragments, broken pieces of documentation, survivor logs that are half corrupted, environmental details that suggest a civilization that was functioning normally right up until the moment it simply was not. That contrast between the ordinary world that existed before and the shattered surface world that exists now is one of the most important things the game is doing with its lore. The Orbiter is the symbol of that rupture. What we know, or what the game strongly suggests, is that the Ark machines did not arrive gradually. There was no slow escalation that gave humanity time to prepare a coordinated global response. The arrival was fast, it was catastrophic, and the Orbiter, based on the evidence scattered through the game's environments and documents, was not simply one part of the invasion. It was the invasion's most visible and most permanent fixture. Everything else the Ark machines brought with them could be destroyed, avoided, or at least comprehended on a human scale. The Orbiter could not be any of those things. It was up there, orbiting, and there was nothing anyone could do about that. The Ark machines themselves are referred to throughout the game simply as the Arks. The word has weight in the game's world. You can hear it in how survivors talk about them, or rather in how they write about them in the logs you find scattered across the map. There is a particular quality to the language people use when writing about the Arks that is different from the language they use to describe other threats. When survivors describe a crawler, for example, they use technical language. They describe behavior, patrol routes, weaknesses. When they describe the orbiter, the language shifts. It becomes observational and distant. People describe watching it, they describe its light, they describe the sound it makes before a strike. They do not describe how to fight it because there is no document in the game that suggests anyone ever tried. The surface world of Ark Raiders is a ruin. That is the first thing the game establishes. The environments you move through are not freshly destroyed. They have been destroyed for a long time. Vegetation has reclaimed parts of structures. Rust has eaten through metal. Things have settled. This is important because it tells you that the Ark invasion is not recent. Whatever happened, it happened far enough back that the world has had time to develop a kind of equilibrium around the destruction. The ruins feel stable in a way that fresh catastrophe does not feel stable. And sitting in the middle of all of that accumulated time is the orbiter, still up there, still functioning, still striking. One possible reading of this is that the orbiter was never meant to be a temporary weapon. A temporary weapon gets used and then removed or destroyed, or repurposed. The orbiter has been in orbit for years, potentially decades, depending on how long the invasion has been underway, and it shows no signs of degradation or withdrawal. If anything, the game suggests, through the behavior of the Ark ground units, that the orbiter occupies a kind of sacred position in their operational logic. Ground units do not attempt to protect the orbiter because it does not need protecting. They do not coordinate with it in the way allies coordinate with support weapons. They simply exist alongside it, and the orbiter does what the orbiter does, and everything else adjusts. The very first time you encounter the orbiter as a player, you are not introduced to it with any ceremony. There is no cutscene, no dramatic reveal. You are simply operating on the surface, and at some point you become aware of it the way people become aware of the moon, which is to say that it is just there, enormous and silent and indifferent. That design choice is worth pausing on. The game could have chosen to introduce the orbiter dramatically. It chose not to. And that understatement is, in retrospect, more frightening than any dramatic reveal could have been. The most dangerous thing in the game is introduced as simply being a fact of the world. When the orbiter initiates a strike, the sequence of events that follows has a particular quality to it that distinguishes it from every other threat in the game. Other Ark machines respond to you. They detect you, they pursue you, they engage you. The orbiter does none of those things. It is not responding to you, it is not even aware of you in any meaningful sense. It is executing a function that it was designed to execute, and you happen to be in the area. This distinction between a machine that hunts and a machine that simply acts is one of the most interesting things the game's lore suggests about the Ark hierarchy. Not everything in the Ark force is oriented around the humans on the surface. Some things are operating on a completely different agenda. The debris that the orbiter sends down during a strike is described in various survivor documents as meteoric. The comparison to meteors is interesting not just as a description of what the impacts look like, but as a suggestion of scale. A meteor is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It is a force of nature. Calling the orbiter's strikes meteoric is a way of placing them in a category that exists outside of warfare. You do not fight a meteor. You do not outsmart it. You survive it, or you do not. The language survivors use to describe the orbiter's strikes consistently places them in that category of things that are beyond human response, which tells you something about how even the people who have lived alongside this threat for years still experience it. The flaming nature of the debris is worth examining on its own. The game depicts the incoming strikes as wreathed in fire, which is consistent with what you would expect from objects entering the atmosphere at high velocity. But it is also a visual language that carries enormous psychological weight. Fire from the sky. In almost every human cultural tradition, fire descending from above has a specific meaning. It means judgment. It means consequence. It means something that cannot be negotiated with. The game is drawing on that imagery very deliberately when it depicts orbiter strikes. And it is worth asking whether the Ark machines themselves understand the symbolic dimension of that imagery, or whether the terror is a byproduct of a purely functional system. What the game suggests about Ark machine intelligence is complicated. The ground units display behavior that is clearly adaptive and goal-oriented. They learn within certain limits. They respond to stimuli. They make something that resembles decisions. But the orbiter's behavior is different. It does not adapt. It does not respond to stimuli in any human-readable way. It follows a pattern. The pattern leads to a strike. The strike occurs. And then the pattern begins again. This regularity, this absolute consistency, suggests that whatever intelligence governs the orbiter, if intelligence is even the right word, it is operating on timescales and through frameworks that are fundamentally alien to the adaptive, responsive logic of the ground units. There is a document you can find in the game, one of the survivor records from the early days of the invasion, that describes the orbiter as a clock. Not metaphorically, the writer seems to mean this quite literally. They describe it as a clock that counts down to something, and they express uncertainty about what that something is. The countdown they are describing is not the strike timer that players experience in a match. It predates that. They are describing something larger, a longer cycle. The nature of that cycle is never explained in the document, which either means the writer did not know, or that the information was in a part of the document that has been corrupted, or that the game is deliberately withholding it. Any of those three options is interesting. The physical scale of the orbiter is addressed only indirectly in the game's lore. Nobody describes its dimensions in precise terms. What survivor accounts do describe is the way it appears in the sky. Several accounts independently describe it as being visible during daylight hours, which tells you something significant. Objects in low Earth orbit are generally only visible at dawn or dusk, when they are illuminated by the sun against a dark sky. An object visible during full daylight is either extremely large, extremely reflective, or operating with its own light source. Possibly all three. The accounts suggest something that occupies a portion of the sky that no human-made satellite or station ever occupied, something that you look at and feel the wrongness of immediately, because nothing that large should be up there. Several survivor accounts describe a sound associated with the orbiter that precedes a strike. This sound is described differently by different witnesses, which is itself informative. Some describe it as a low thrum, a vibration felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. Others describe it as a high-pitched tone that appears suddenly and builds. Others describe silence, an unnatural cessation of ambient sound, as the first indicator that something is about to happen. The variation in these accounts could mean that different people are perceiving different components of a complex signal. It could also mean that the orbiter's pre-strike emissions affect people differently, possibly based on proximity, angle, or individual physiological variation. The game does not resolve this. It simply leaves you with several accounts that partially contradict each other. The relationship between the orbiter and the other ARC machines on the ground is one of the questions this video is most interested in, because understanding that relationship tells you something about the ARC hierarchy that you cannot get from studying the ground units in isolation. The ground units have observable behaviors. They patrol, they engage threats, they defend certain locations. They appear to communicate with each other in some fashion. But their behavior in relation to the orbiter is harder to characterize because they do not appear to interact with it directly. Nobody in the game's lore describes seeing a ground unit receive a command from the orbiter, or acknowledge a strike, or adjust behavior in response to orbital activity. They simply continue operating, which raises the question of whether the orbiter is giving them orders at all, or whether it is doing something else entirely. One possible reading, and I want to be clear that this is interpretation based on circumstantial evidence, is that the orbiter does not command the ARC ground units. Instead, the orbiter may be maintaining something. It may be providing something that the ground units depend on without ever explicitly coordinating with them. Think of it like a broadcast tower. A broadcast tower does not communicate directly with every device that receives its signal. It simply transmits, and everything in range either receives the transmission or it does not. If the orbiter functions as something like a broadcast source for the ARC collective, then its relationship to the ground units would look exactly the way the game depicts it. Present, essential, invisible in its operation, never directly engaging. The strike behavior, the thing that makes the orbiter so significant from a gameplay standpoint, does not fit neatly into this broadcast model. If the orbiter is primarily a signal source or a coordination mechanism, why does it periodically fire on the surface? The answer the game seems to be pointing toward, and again this is interpretation, is that the strikes and the broadcast function are separate systems. The orbiter is not one thing. It is many things sharing a platform. The orbital strikes may be a weapons system operating on its own logic, entirely independent of whatever else the orbiter is doing at any given moment. You do not have to choose between the orbiter as weapon and the orbiter as something else. It might be both simultaneously. The debris that falls during a strike is one of the most physically interesting things the game describes. The game characterizes it as meteoric and as causing massive fatal explosions on impact. This is not the behavior of simple kinetic impactors. Kinetic impactors, objects dropped from orbit, derive their destructive power entirely from velocity and mass. They do not need to be flaming or explosive. The explosive quality of the orbiter's debris suggests that the material being dropped is not simply matter. It is either carrying an explosive payload, or it is made of something that reacts on impact in a way that raw kinetic material would not. Several player-found documents describe the craters left by orbiter strikes in terms that suggest chemical or energetic contamination rather than purely physical damage. The ground around strike points behaves differently afterward. Things do not grow there. Machines avoid those areas for a period. That last detail, that ARC ground units avoid strike zones for a period following a hit, is one of the more puzzling pieces of evidence in the game's lore. If the Orbiter is a weapon serving the Ark Collective, and the Ark ground units are part of that collective, why would the units avoid areas the weapon has just targeted? There are a few ways to read this. One reading is that the Orbiter's strikes produce a byproduct that is harmful to the Ark machines as well as to humans, and the units are simply avoiding a hazard. Another reading is that the units are responding to some kind of signal the strikes produce, waiting for a condition to change before re-entering the area. A third reading, and the one I find most interesting, is that the Orbiter and the ground units are not as closely integrated as we assume, that the Orbiter may be operating on an agenda that the ground units are not fully party to. To understand why that third reading matters, you have to step back and think about what the Ark invasion looks like from the outside. The ground units secure territory. They eliminate threats. They defend resources. This is invasion behavior that maps onto human military logic in ways we can understand. The Orbiter does not map onto human military logic in the same way. Its strikes do not discriminate. They hit terrain that Ark ground units also occupy. They create hazards that the ground forces then have to navigate around. A military force does not use weapons that inconvenience its own troops unless there is a reason that outweighs that inconvenience, or unless the weapon is not under the command of anyone who cares about the troops. The question of who, or what, commands the Orbiter is central to everything else in this video. The game does not answer it directly. What it does is leave a trail of implications that, taken together, point towards something specific. The ground units appear to have a hierarchical command structure. There are smaller units and larger units. There are units that seem to direct other units. There is something resembling a chain of command. But the Orbiter does not fit cleanly into that chain. It is not at the top of it in the way a commander is at the top of a military hierarchy. It is adjacent to it, parallel to it, operating alongside the ground force hierarchy rather than above it. This parallel structure, if that is what the lore is suggesting, has enormous implications for how we understand the Ark invasion as a whole. It would mean that the invasion is not a single unified campaign with a single command structure. It would mean that there are at least two distinct operational logics at work simultaneously. One is the ground force logic, which is about occupation, resource control, and threat elimination. The other is whatever the Orbiter is doing, which is something different, something that the ground forces work around rather than with. And if that is true, then understanding the Orbiter means understanding a layer of the Ark presence on Earth that is entirely separate from everything the Raiders deal with on the surface. The survivors in Ark Raiders, the people who live underground and send Raiders to the surface, have a particular relationship with the Orbiter that is different from their relationship with the ground units. Ground units are a constant, manageable threat. Raiders go to the surface regularly. They have methods for dealing with ground units. They have knowledge about ground unit behavior that they have accumulated over years or decades. The Orbiter sits outside that body of knowledge entirely. You cannot develop expertise about the Orbiter the way you can develop expertise about a crawler. You can note its patterns and time your extractions accordingly, but you cannot engage it, outmaneuver it, or outsmart it. It operates on a scale that places it permanently outside the category of things that Raiders can do anything about. This asymmetry in how survivors relate to ground units versus how they relate to the Orbiter shows up clearly in the tone of surviving documents. Documents about ground units are often technical. They describe unit types, behavioral patterns, weaknesses, encounter outcomes. They read like practical guides assembled by people who are trying to share useful information with others who will face the same threats. Documents about the Orbiter are different. They read less like guides and more like records. People describe what they saw, what they heard, what happened. They do not conclude with advice about what to do differently next time, because there is no next time framework for Orbiter strikes. You get out before the strike, or you do not get out. The finality of that calculus is something the game builds into its design at every level, but it is also something the lore reinforces in a specific way. The Orbiter is never presented as something that might be destroyed or neutralized. No survivor document speculates about taking it down. No research log describes someone working on anti-orbital weapons. The possibility is simply absent from the world the game describes, and the absence of that possibility is itself a piece of lore. It tells you that enough time has passed for people to stop hoping, that at some point Humanity collectively moved the orbiter from the category of problems that might be solved into the category of facts that must be survived around. That shift from seeing something as a problem to seeing it as a condition of existence is one of the most quietly devastating things the game's lore conveys. To close out this first chapter, I want to sit with one image that the game gives you and that I think captures something essential about what the orbiter represents within the world of Ark Raiders. It is not a dramatic image. It is actually quite simple. Several survivor accounts describe children who have grown up entirely in the underground. These children have never been to the surface. They have grown up on stories about the Arks, about raiders, about the ruined world above them. And in those accounts, when the children ask questions about the Ark machines, they tend to ask about the ones they have been told about. The crawlers, the bombers, the various ground units. These are the machines that exist in the stories. But the orbiter, these accounts suggest, is not something children ask about, because the orbiter is not part of the stories. It is part of the sky. It is part of the world as it exists. You do not ask a child to explain the sun. You do not explain to them that the sun was not always there. And in the world of Ark Raiders, the orbiter occupies that same category of things that are so permanent, so fundamental to the reality that exists now, that they do not require explanation. They simply are. The fact that the orbiter has achieved that level of normalization within the survivor's world is more unsettling than any description of its destructive capability. Weapons are scary. A weapon that has been in the sky long enough to become a feature of the world is something else entirely. Chapter 2. The Architecture of the Orbiter. When players first start paying attention to the orbiter as an object rather than just a mechanic, one of the first questions they tend to ask is what it actually looks like up close. The game does not give you that. You see the orbiter at distance, you see its light, you see what it sends down. You do not get to examine its hull, walk through its interior, or study its systems. This is a deliberate withholding, and it is worth thinking about why. The game gives you detailed access to Ark ground units. You can find them, observe them, study their behavior, and in some cases, pick apart what they leave behind. The orbiter is kept at a remove. It is always orbital, always distant, and that deliberate inaccessibility is part of what makes it so imposing within the game's lore. What the game does give you, through environmental fragments and survivor accounts, are impressions of the orbiter's visual signature. The light it emits, the silhouette it casts, the way it appears against different sky conditions. These impressions, taken together, allow you to build something like a picture of the object, even if that picture will always be incomplete. Several accounts describe a structure that is not shaped like a conventional satellite. Human-made orbital platforms historically tend to have solar panel arrays extending outward, giving them a characteristic cross or rectangular shape. The orbiter, as described in Ark Raiders lore, does not seem to have that geometry. The accounts that describe its shape most clearly characterize it as dense, compact relative to its size, something that carries its mass close to its center rather than spreading it outward. The density observation is interesting because it cuts against what you might expect from something that has been in orbit for an extended period. Objects in space do not need to conserve space the way objects on a surface do. The most efficient shapes for orbital platforms typically are expansive, spreading systems out to maximize heat dissipation and power generation. A dense, compact orbital structure suggests either that the designers were not concerned with those efficiency considerations, or that they solved them in ways that did not require the typical spatial expansion. Either possibility says something interesting about the engineering behind the orbiter. If the Ark machines built it, they built it according to design priorities that differ significantly from anything humanity ever put into orbit. The light that the orbiter emits is described differently in accounts from different time periods. Earlier accounts, those that seem to date from closer to the initial invasion, describe the orbiter's light as unfamiliar. Several writers use the word wrong in relation to it. They describe watching it move across the sky and feeling that the light it produces is wrong in a way they cannot fully articulate. Later accounts are less emotionally charged in this way. They describe the orbiter's light, more matter-of-factly, as a navigational reference point, as a way of estimating time. The emotional response to the light's quality has diminished. People have gotten used to it. But the earlier accounts are the ones that capture something raw and important, which is that the orbiter's visual presence not just its destructive capability, initially struck witnesses as deeply alien. The idea that the orbiter's light is wrong is one of those details that the game does not explain and probably never will. It invites speculation. One possibility is that the orbiter produces light outside the wavelengths that human eyes are fully comfortable processing. There are frequencies of light that the human visual system can detect, but that produce a sense of unease rather than normal perception. Another possibility is that the wrongness witnesses describe is not about the light's physical properties at all, but about the cognitive dissonance of seeing an artificial structure in orbit producing light that does not behave the way artificial light normally behaves. It does not flicker. It does not have the warm quality of combustion or the clean quality of LED. It simply emanates steadily and without variation, and that constancy reads as wrong to a human nervous system calibrated for natural light sources. The orbital path of the orbiter is described in several documents as unusual. Human satellites and stations follow predictable orbital mechanics. You can calculate where they will be at any given time based on known physical laws. The orbiter, based on survivor observations, does not behave entirely predictably. Several accounts note that its path varies in ways that cannot be fully explained by atmospheric drag or gravitational influences. This suggests that the orbiter is not simply in a passive orbit, it is actively maneuvering. Something on board is making adjustments to its trajectory, which means something on board has either a power source capable of supporting ongoing maneuvers or a propulsion system efficient enough to make those maneuvers without depleting itself over the years of its operation. Either of those things, in the context of what humanity was capable of building, represents technology that significantly exceeds what anyone put into orbit before the invasion. The active maneuvering detail is important for another reason. Passive orbits decay. Objects in low Earth orbit without active station keeping gradually lose altitude and eventually re-enter the atmosphere. If the orbiter has been in orbit for the years or decades that the game's ruined world implies, and if it is still functional, then it is actively maintaining its orbital position. That requires ongoing energy expenditure. That requires functioning systems. That requires, in some sense, ongoing intent. The orbiter is not coasting. It is choosing, or something aboard it is choosing, to remain exactly where it is. That is not the behavior of an abandoned platform or a drifting wreck. That is the behavior of a system that is doing exactly what it was designed to do. What powers the orbiter is not directly addressed in any in-game lore I have found. The scale of the energy requirements for something of its apparent size and operational longevity places it well beyond anything solar panels could plausibly supply. Nuclear power could theoretically sustain it for the relevant time frame, but the Ark machines do not appear to use nuclear technology in the way humanity did. Their power systems, based on what you can observe in ground units, operate on principles that survivors have documented but not fully understood. The energy sources in Ark machine systems have been described as dense in a way that does not match any human energy storage technology. If the orbiter uses a scaled-up version of whatever powers the ground units, then its operational longevity makes more sense, but it also deepens the mystery of what that power source actually is. The weapon systems of the orbiter are the most directly observable thing about it, because their outputs reach the surface where survivors can study them. The debris that comes down during a strike has been examined by various researcher figures referenced in the game's documents. What those examinations seem to find is that the material is not purely natural. It is not simply rock accelerated from orbit. The composition of material recovered from strike zones suggests something that began in the orbiter and was transformed during atmospheric entry, either by the heat of entry or by some process that preceded the entry. The transformation is consistent across different strikes, which means it is not random damage from the re-entry process. It is a consistent output. The orbiter is producing a consistent material with consistent properties, and that material is then being delivered to the surface in a form that maximizes the damage it causes. The targeting of orbiter strikes is one of the aspects of its weapon systems that the lore is most ambiguous about. Survivors in the game's world have attempted to identify a pattern in where strikes land. Some accounts describe what seems like random distribution across a map. Others describe strikes that appear to cluster in ways that suggest targeting logic, hitting areas of high activity, hitting extraction corridors, hitting positions that would be tactically significant if someone were trying to prevent extraction. The game does not commit to a definitive answer about whether the strikes are targeted or whether they follow a probabilistic distribution that humans naturally interpret as intentional, because that is how human pattern recognition works. Both possibilities have interesting implications, and the game seems content to leave the question unresolved. If the strikes are genuinely targeted, then the orbiter has the ability to observe the surface in detail and make targeting decisions in something close to real time. That would require sensors of considerable sophistication and a processing capability that can translate sensor data into strike coordinates. It would also raise the question of what criteria the orbiter uses for targeting. If it is trying to prevent human extraction, as some accounts seem to imply, then it has an operational goal that is specifically oriented around the human presence on the surface. That would mean the orbiter is aware of humans in a way that is more active and more intentional than simple scheduled bombardment. If the strikes are not truly targeted, if they follow a pattern that is regular enough to look intentional, but is actually driven by some other logic entirely, then the orbiter's strikes may be a byproduct of a process that has nothing to do with humans at all. Something the orbiter does on a schedule for reasons entirely internal to its own operation, and humans have been in the way of that process consistently enough to build a narrative about being targeted. That second possibility is in some ways more disturbing than the first. Being deliberately targeted implies that you matter to the thing targeting you. Not being targeted at all, simply being incidental to a process that would occur exactly the same way whether you existed or not, implies something about your importance that is harder to absorb. The physical footprint of a strike is something several survivor documents describe in detail. The initial impact is described as catastrophic. The area of total destruction around the point of impact is significant. But beyond the immediate destruction zone, there is a larger area of what survivors call secondary effect. Equipment fails in the secondary zone. Communication systems go down. Arc ground units behave anomalously for a period after a strike, moving in directions and patterns that do not match their normal patrol logic. These secondary effects suggest that the orbiter strikes produce something beyond kinetic energy and heat. There is an electromagnetic or informational component to what lands that affects both human technology and, apparently, arc systems in the nearby area. That last point, that arc systems are also affected by secondary strike effects, is one of the most interesting and least discussed details in the game's lore. If the orbiter is a weapon of the Arc Collective used to suppress human activity on the surface, why would its strikes produce effects that also disrupt Arc ground unit behavior? One reading is that the disruption is collateral. The strikes produce a broad spectrum effect that hits everything in range, and the ground units are simply in range. Another reading is that the disruption of nearby arc ground units is intentional, that whatever the strikes produce is meant to affect arc systems specifically in some way, possibly resetting them, recalibrating them, or transmitting something to them that requires the kind of intensity only a strike can produce. That second reading points toward a function of the orbiter that is entirely separate from weapons use. If the strikes recalibrate or reset arc ground units in the secondary zone, then the orbiter may serve a maintenance or coordination role for the ground force, one that it fulfills through an intensely destructive mechanism that has the unfortunate side effect of also destroying everything else in the area. This is not how a well-designed command system would operate. It is how a system would operate if it was designed for a purpose that did not include careful consideration of collateral effects, or if the arc machines simply do not evaluate collateral effects the way humans would, because the collateral that matters to them is not human life or human infrastructure. The structure of the orbiter, based on everything the game implies without stating directly, seems to be divided into at least two distinct operational systems. There is something that manages the orbital mechanics, the station keeping, the attitude control, the basic functions of staying in space and staying functional. And there is something else, something that manages the ground-facing operations, the observation, the strike systems, and whatever the secondary effects of those strikes are actually accomplishing. Whether these two systems are integrated or whether they operate independently is unclear. The accounts that suggest the orbiter continues its regular behavior even when ground activity beneath it is minimal or absent tend to support the idea that the orbital maintenance system operates completely independently of whatever drives the strike behavior. It does what it does regardless of what is happening on the surface. The absence of any evidence of arc machine activity around the orbiter itself is worth noting. No account in the game describes arc units launching from or returning to the orbiter. No account describes seeing smaller arc units entering or exiting the platform. This could simply mean that such activity happens at altitudes or in conditions where surface observers could not see it. But it is also consistent with the idea that the orbiter is entirely automated, that there is no crew, no oversight, no arc intelligence aboard, making decisions in real time, just systems executing functions they were programmed to execute, with no ongoing supervision or adjustment. That level of autonomy, in a platform of that scale and destructive capability, operating over the ruins of a human civilization for what may be decades, is its own kind of statement about what the arc machines are, and how they think about long-duration operations. The corrosion resistance of the orbiter, the fact that it appears to be just as functional now as it presumably was at the start of the invasion, tells you something about the materials and design philosophies involved in its construction. Space is hard on equipment. Thermal cycling, radiation exposure, micrometeorite impacts, and the stresses of ongoing operation degrade even the most robustly built human satellites over timeframes measured in years or decades. The orbiter has apparently survived all of those stresses and maintained full operational capacity. Either it was built to standards that far exceed anything humanity achieved in orbital construction, or it is actively maintaining itself, repairing damage as it accumulates. Both possibilities are consistent with what we see in the ground units, which also display what appears to be self-repair behavior in certain circumstances. The arc machines, as a whole, seem to be built with longevity as a primary design criterion. Self-repair in the arc ground units is documented in several survivor accounts. People describe units that were damaged in an engagement and that reappeared later in better condition than they were left. The repair process is never observed directly, which is its own interesting detail. Nobody in the documents describes watching an arc unit repair itself. They only describe the before and after states. This suggests that whatever repair process the arc machines use, it either occurs very rapidly or it occurs in places and conditions where humans are not observing. Both of those characteristics, if applied to the orbiter, would explain why the orbiter maintains operational condition without any observable maintenance activity. It maintains itself, and it does so in ways that are either too fast or too remote for anyone to document. The electromagnetic signature of the orbiter is something that early invasion researchers apparently attempted to analyze. There are references in the game to monitoring equipment being set up specifically to track the orbiter's emissions. What those monitoring efforts found is described only fragmentarily, but the fragments suggest that the orbiter emits across a range of frequencies that does not match any known human technology and does not match any natural astronomical signal source. The emissions are structured. They contain pattern and repetition in ways that random noise does not. But the structure of those emissions has not, as far as the game reveals, been decoded. Researchers documented the structure without being able to interpret it, which means that the orbiter has been broadcasting something consistently for the entire duration of the invasion, and nobody knows what. That uninterpreted broadcast is one of the most haunting details in the orbiter's lore. The possibility that the orbiter has been saying something all along, something that is in principle understandable, but that humanity never had the capacity or the time to decode, is the kind of detail that recontextualizes everything else about the arc presence on Earth. What if the orbiter's behavior is not simply a weapons platform executing a function? What if it is a communicator, broadcasting to something, waiting for a response, and the strikes are not its primary purpose but a secondary function that happens to be the most visible thing it does? The game does not answer that question. I am not sure it is meant to. Some lore serves the purpose of resolving mysteries, and some lore serves the purpose of making the world feel larger than any single explanation can contain. The orbiter seems to occupy the second category. Every detail you learn about it opens onto further uncertainty. The further you follow those uncertainties, the stranger the picture becomes. And I want to follow them considerably further in the chapters ahead. To close this chapter, I want to note one visual detail from the game that I find hard to let go of. When the orbiter initiates a strike sequence, there is a moment just before the debris begins to fall when the light from the orbiter changes. Players who pay attention to this, and it is easy to miss because the action at that point in a match tends to demand your attention elsewhere, describe the light becoming more concentrated, more directed, more deliberate. Whether that visual effect is purely aesthetic, just the game communicating to you that the strike sequence has begun, or whether it is a representation of something the orbiter is actually doing in the lore, changing its output, focusing something, orienting toward the surface, is one of those small details that I keep coming back to. Because if that light change represents something real in the fiction, then there is a moment, brief and probably unnoticed by anyone on the surface who does not know what to look for, when the orbiter sees what it is about to hit. Chapter 3. The Arc Collective and Command Structure. To understand where the orbiter sits within the Arc machine hierarchy, you first have to understand what that hierarchy looks like based on what the game actually shows you. Arc Raiders does not hand you an org chart. It does not give you a named commander and a list of subordinates. What it does is show you behavior, and from behavior you can infer structure, in the same way that a field biologist can describe a wolf pack's hierarchy without ever seeing the wolves exchange explicit signals about rank. The Arc machines communicate and coordinate in ways that are observable, even if they are not fully understandable. And those observable patterns suggest a structure that is more complex than simple top-down command. The ground units in Arc Raiders display clearly differentiated roles. Some units are mobile and aggressive, operating at the forward edge of any contested area. Some units are more defensive, holding positions and responding to incursions, rather than patrolling actively. Some units appear to direct the behavior of others, positioning themselves in relation to a group of units in ways that suggest coordination function rather than combat function. This differentiation of roles implies something like a command structure, even if the mechanism of command is not explicitly depicted. Something is directing these units into their respective roles. Something is ensuring that the aggressive units and the defensive units and the coordinating units are present in the right proportions, in the right places. Whatever that something is, it is producing a coherent and effective ground force from units that appear individually capable of independent operation. The question the orbiter raises is whether it fits into this structure as a component, or whether it represents a separate system that operates alongside the ground force without being truly integrated with it. The evidence the game provides for each position is worth examining. On the side of integration, you have the fact that the orbiter's strikes effectively serve the interests of the ground force by clearing the surface of human activity. If the ground force's goal is to maintain control of the surface and eliminate threats, then the orbiter's periodic strikes support that goal by making the surface untenable for extended human presence. This functional alignment between the orbiter's behavior and the ground force's apparent goals is the primary argument for seeing the orbiter as part of a single unified command structure. On the side of separation, you have the behavioral anomalies around strike zones that were described in the previous chapter. You have the absence of any direct communication between the orbiter and ground units that can be documented. You have the fact that the orbiter's strikes disrupt ground unit behavior rather than coordinating with it. And you have the scale difference between the orbiter and the largest known ground units, which is enormous, suggesting a qualitative difference rather than simply a quantitative one. The largest ground units in the game are impressive and dangerous. The orbiter exists in a completely different category of scale. When things differ by that many orders of magnitude, it is worth asking whether they really belong to the same system. One way of thinking about the Arc hierarchy that the lore seems to support, without ever stating directly, is a layered model. At the base layer, you have the individual ground units, operating with their own limited autonomous intelligence, capable of making tactical decisions within a constrained set of parameters. At an intermediate layer, you have some form of coordination mechanism that organizes those units into the coherent force you observe on the surface. This intermediate layer might be a specific unit type that functions as a local commander, or it might be a communication system that all ground units participate in, and that produces coordination as an emergent property rather than through explicit command. At a higher layer still is whatever is responsible for the overall Arc presence on Earth. the strategic level, the level that decided to come here and has decided to stay. Where the orbiter sits in this model is the most interesting question. It is clearly not at the base layer. It does not function like an individual ground unit scaled up. Its operational logic is too different. It is also not clearly at the intermediate coordination layer, because the evidence for it actively coordinating ground forces is weak. The best fit is the highest layer, the strategic level. The orbiter as the physical manifestation of whatever made the decision to come to Earth, and whatever is maintaining the arc presence here. Not a weapon in the service of the ground forces, but the thing the ground forces are in the service of. That reframing changes how you read almost everything the ground units do. Instead of seeing the arc ground force as an army of occupation, with the orbiter as air support, you start to see the ground units as something more like caretakers or workers, or enforcers for a presence whose main manifestation is not on the surface at all, but in orbit above it. The surface activity, the patrol routes, the resource control, the threat elimination, all of that might be less about the arc machines wanting the surface and more about the arc machines maintaining the conditions that the orbiter needs to do whatever it is actually here to do. This reading requires you to take seriously the possibility that the orbiter's strikes, which look like the most obviously aggressive thing the arc presence does, are not actually the most important thing the arc presence is doing. They are visible. They are violent. They are the thing that humans have built their survival strategies around. But visibility and importance are not the same thing. The most important thing the orbiter does might be something that produces no visible output at all. No debris, no explosion, no light change, just quiet, continuous, unobservable operation in orbit that the ground forces are structured to protect and support. The command hierarchy among the arc ground units has been studied by various researcher figures referenced in the game's documents. Those researchers have identified what they call class hierarchies in the arc force structure. Smaller, simpler units at the base, larger, more capable units higher up, evidence of something that directs the behavior of groups of smaller units. The terminology researchers use for these class levels varies by document, reflecting the fact that there was never a unified human research effort that produced canonical classifications. Different survivor communities developed their own terminologies, and those terminologies are inconsistent in the lore fragments you find in the game. This inconsistency is itself a piece of world building. It reflects the fragmented, isolated nature of human survival after the invasion. Nobody had the luxury of a coordinated scientific program. What the researcher documents do seem to agree on, despite their terminological inconsistency, is that the arc hierarchy shows evidence of design. It is not an evolved hierarchy in the biological sense. It did not develop through a process of competition and selection. It was built this way. Units have roles because they were made for those roles. The hierarchy exists because it was designed to exist. And if it was designed, then something designed it. Something made the decision about what kinds of units to build, what roles those units would fill, how they would relate to each other. Something designed the arc military force from the ground up, knowing what it was going to be used for. That designing intelligence is what some researchers in the game's lore refer to when they speculate about an arc prime intelligence, a central decision-making entity that either created the arc machines or directs them, or both. The game does not confirm or deny the existence of such an entity. It leaves the question open. But the consistency of arc machine behavior across the entire surface, the fact that ground units in one part of the map behave according to the same logic as ground units in another, completely separated part of the map, implies coordination at a level that transcends any local command hierarchy. Something is maintaining consistency across the entire arc force. Something is ensuring that the design intent of the arc hierarchy is being faithfully executed everywhere the arc machines operate. The orbiter is the most obvious candidate for that coordination role. It is in orbit, which means it has potential line of sight to all of the surface simultaneously. It emits structured signals that have not been decoded. It has been in place for the entire duration of the arc presence. If any single component of the arc force is positioned to maintain broad coordination across the entire ground force, it is the orbiter. This does not mean that the orbiter is issuing specific orders to specific ground units in real time. It might mean something more diffuse, a continuous broadcast that all ARC units receive and that keeps them synchronized to a common operational framework, a signal that maintains the consistency of ARC machine behavior, the way a radio network maintains the synchronization of clocks across a geographic area. The clocking metaphor is one that keeps appearing in ARC Raiders lore, always indirectly, always in contexts that do not explicitly identify the orbiter as the clock. But the accumulation of those references is hard to dismiss. The survivor document that described the orbiter as a clock was not unique. Several other documents in the game use temporal language when describing the orbiter or when describing the overall ARC presence on Earth. References to cycles, to intervals, to things that happen when a condition is met and then reset and happen again. The ARC invasion in these documents is described less as an ongoing war and more as a process with phases, a process that is moving towards something. And the orbiter, in this framing, is the timekeeper. What the process is moving toward is not disclosed in any in-game lore I have encountered. Whether the game knows and is withholding it, or whether the game itself has not defined it yet, is impossible to say from the outside. What can be said is that this framing, the ARC presence as a process rather than an invasion, the orbiter as a timekeeper for that process, is the most internally consistent interpretation of the available evidence. It accounts for the orbiter's behavior in a way that pure weapons platform theories do not. It accounts for the secondary effects of strikes and the disruption of ground unit behavior in strike zones. It accounts for the uninterpreted broadcasts. It accounts for the sense of deep time in the game's world, the feeling that what you're experiencing is not the beginning or the middle of something, but a stage in a much longer sequence. The ARC ground unit's relationship to the process in this framing is interesting. If they are caretakers for a longer duration project that the orbiter represents, then their aggression toward humans is not the core of their purpose. It is a secondary function, something they do because humans interfere with the primary function. The primary function is something else, something that requires an undisturbed surface, resources secured, threats eliminated. The raiders who go to the surface in this reading are not fighting an army that wants to occupy human territory. They are disrupting a process whose full nature they do not understand, because the thing overseeing that process is in orbit and has never communicated with them in any terms they can decode. The size of the orbiter relative to the ground forces it ostensibly serves is another data point that pushes against the pure military hierarchy interpretation. A command structure scales its command apparatus to the force it commands. A battalion commander does not need a structure the size of a city. The orbiter's apparent scale, based on what the game implies, is vastly disproportionate to what would be needed to command a ground force of the size you encounter in ARC Raiders matches. That disproportionality suggests that the orbiter's size reflects a purpose that is not primarily about commanding ground forces. Whatever it is that requires that scale, it is something other than military command. Researcher documents in the game have noted this disproportionality without being able to explain it. Some researchers speculate about the orbiter containing vast internal structures whose purpose is unknown. Others suggest that its apparent scale from the surface is deceptive, that what you see from the ground is a smaller portion of a larger structure, most of which is not directly visible. The possibility that there is significantly more to the orbiter than is externally visible is consistent with the dense, compact description from earlier accounts. If the most significant parts of the orbiter are internal, then exterior observation gives you almost no information about its true nature. The internal structures of the orbiter, if they exist and if they are as significant as some accounts imply, are the part of this lore that I find most genuinely unknown. Not unknown in the sense of waiting for further updates to fill in, but unknown in the sense that the game seems to have made a deliberate choice to keep them unknown. The orbiter is defined by what it does, not by what it is. You know it by its outputs. You do not get to know it by its components. And that choice to make the orbiter knowable only through its behavior, never through its structure, is consistent with the way the game handles the ARC machines more broadly. You know what they do. You do not know what they are. To close this chapter, I want to propose a way of thinking about the ARC hierarchy that I will be building on throughout the rest of this video. Think of the ARC presence on Earth as having three layers: the surface layer, which is the ground forces, the units raiders encounter and deal with; the orbital layer, which is the orbiter; visible, active, and only partially understood, and potentially a third layer, something that neither the surface observers nor the orbiter's observable behavior can fully illuminate, a layer that the law seems to gesture toward without naming. The surface layer is about the present, the orbital layer is about the process. The third layer, if it exists, is about the purpose, and the orbiter is the interface between the surface layer and whatever the purpose ultimately is. Chapter 4. The Descent. How the Ark invasion began. The question of how the Ark machines arrived on Earth is one of the most foundational questions in Ark Raiders lore, and it is one that the game answers only partially and obliquely. What is clear, from the evidence the game provides, is that the arrival was from above. The Ark machines came down. And the orbiter, based on everything we have examined so far, was not something that arrived with the invasion and then took up its orbital position. It was already there, or it was the first thing to arrive, or it was the thing that made all other arrivals possible. The exact sequence is uncertain, but the primacy of the orbiter in the overall picture of the invasion is hard to dispute. Early invasion survivor accounts are among the most valuable and most fragmented pieces of lore in Ark Raiders. They are valuable because they describe conditions from before the full establishment of the Ark ground presence, which means they capture a transition that later accounts take for granted. They are fragmented because the conditions of the invasion's initial phase were obviously not conducive to careful documentation. People were describing what was happening around them under severe duress, often without knowing what they were looking at or what it meant. The accounts that survive are often incomplete, often contradictory on details, and often haunted by a quality of not quite understanding that the writers themselves acknowledge. The earliest of these accounts, those that seem to date from the first days or weeks of the Ark presence, describe the orbiter's arrival as the first clearly anomalous thing that happened, before the ground forces appeared, before the destruction on the surface became systematic. There was the orbiter. There was something in the sky that had not been there before. These accounts describe people noticing it the way you would notice any new astronomical object, with curiosity and some alarm, but not yet with the terror that later accounts carry. At that early stage, before anyone understood what was coming, the orbiter was just an object, unusual, unexplained, but not yet understood as a harbinger of everything that followed. The transition in those early accounts from curiosity to alarm is rapid. There are accounts that seem to cover a span of only days, in which the tone shifts from describing a puzzling new phenomenon to describing something that is clearly causing harm. The strikes, based on these accounts, did not begin immediately. There was a period, its duration unclear from the fragments, during which the orbiter was present in orbit, but not active in the way it later became. Whether this was a calibration period, a preparation period, or simply a period that served a purpose no observer at the time could understand, is another of those questions the game leaves deliberately open. The appearance of Ark ground units on the surface, in the early invasion accounts, seems to follow the orbiter's establishment rather than precede it. This is consistent with the theory of the orbiter as a coordination and command infrastructure. If the orbiter needed to be in place and operational before the ground presence could be effectively deployed, then the sequence of orbiter first, then ground forces makes strategic sense. You establish your command infrastructure, you ensure it is functional, then you deploy the forces it will be directing. The alternative, that the ground forces arrived independently and the orbiter's placement was coincidental with their arrival, is possible, but requires more assumptions and explains the apparent sequence less elegantly. What the ground forces' arrival looked like, based on early accounts, was not the way an invasion looks in conventional human military terms. There were no landing ships in the traditional sense, no vessels that descended visibly and disgorged troops. The accounts describe ground units simply appearing, present in places where they had not been present before. The mechanism of their delivery to the surface is not described with any clarity in the early accounts. Some accounts suggest they came down in the same way the orbiter's strike debris comes down, at high velocity, protected from re-entry by whatever physical properties the Ark machines are built with. Others suggest something more gradual, units that appeared at the edges of cleared areas and moved inward as conditions permitted. The absence of a clearly described landing mechanism is interesting. It could reflect the chaos of the invasion's early phase. during which organized documentation was essentially impossible. It could also reflect a genuine characteristic of how the Ark machines arrived, which is to say that their method of surface delivery was not dramatic enough to be universally noticed and recorded as a discrete event. If Ark ground units came down individually or in small groups over an extended period, rather than in a single massive landing operation, then there may not have been a single moment of landing that witnesses could describe clearly. The presence simply grew, gradually enough that the shock of it was cumulative rather than instantaneous. The relationship between the orbiter's strikes and the initial Ark ground presence is something several researcher documents attempt to trace. The hypothesis that gets the most attention in these documents is that the orbiter's early strikes served a preparatory function, that before the ground forces could operate effectively, the surface conditions needed to be altered in specific ways, and the strikes were how the orbiter altered them. This hypothesis is consistent with the secondary effects of strikes described earlier, the electromagnetic disruptions, the behavioral anomalies in Ark units in strike zones. If strikes produce effects that are useful to the Ark machines beyond simple destruction, then the early strikes may have been setting up conditions that the ground forces later exploited. What conditions those would be is speculative. The possibilities range from the purely practical, clearing specific areas of obstacles, to the more exotic, altering the physical or informational environment of the surface in ways that benefit Ark machine operation. The researcher documents do not reach a consensus. They describe the hypothesis and present their evidence for it, but they cannot resolve the question because they do not have access to the orbiter itself. They can only observe the surface effects and reason backwards toward the cause. This is the position Ark Raiders consistently puts you in when it comes to the orbiter. You are always observing effects and reasoning backward. The cause itself is always in orbit and always unreachable. The speed of the Ark ground presence's establishment varies considerably across different parts of the game's world, based on the accounts that survive. Some areas appear to have been fully under Ark control very quickly. Others seem to have gone through extended periods of contested status before Ark machines secured them. This variation could reflect differences in the initial deployment of ground forces across different regions. It could also reflect human resistance being more effective in some areas than others. But several accounts suggest a third possibility, which is that the orbiter's coverage patterns influenced how quickly different areas came under Ark control. If the orbiter provides something that Ark ground units need to operate optimally, then areas with better orbiter coverage would have been secured faster, and areas with worse coverage would have taken longer. The nature of what the orbiter might provide that Ark ground units would need is one of the most consistently discussed questions in the researcher documents. Power transmission is one candidate. If the orbiter broadcasts energy that Ark ground units can receive and use, then ground unit performance would be tied to orbiter coverage in a very direct way. This would also explain the orbiter's continuous emissions and the structured signals that researchers detected. They might not be communication signals at all. They might be power broadcasts. The structure in the signal is the structure of an efficient power transmission protocol, not the structure of language. The invasion, in the early accounts, is described in terms that emphasize its comprehensiveness. It was not targeted at specific locations. It was not focused on strategic assets in the human military sense. It appeared everywhere at once, or close enough to everywhere that effective human coordination in response was impossible. This comprehensiveness is itself informative. A targeted invasion focuses resources on high-value objectives. A comprehensive invasion prioritizes coverage over concentration. It suggests that whoever planned the Ark invasion valued being everywhere over being especially strong anywhere. This makes more sense as a strategy if the goal is the surface as a whole, rather than specific things on the surface. It is the strategy of an entity that wants the entire map, not any particular square of it. The orbiter's orbital position supports this comprehensive strategy in a way that a ground-based command center would not. From orbit, the orbiter can maintain line of sight with virtually all of the surface simultaneously, cycling through as it moves along its orbital path. A ground-based command center can only maintain line of sight with its immediate vicinity. If the Ark invasion strategy required coordination and supply across the entire surface simultaneously, the orbiter's orbital position was not just convenient, It was essential to the strategy. The invasion could not have taken the form it took without something in the position the orbiter occupies. Human resistance to the Ark invasion, as described in the game's lore, was initially widespread and eventually became localized and underground. The transition from widespread surface resistance to the current model of underground survival interrupted by surface raids represents the long-term outcome of a contest the humans were ultimately unable to win at the strategic level. What they won instead is survivability, the ability to continue existing underground, sending individuals to the surface for resources but never attempting to hold the surface against the Ark presence. This is the world Ark Raiders takes place in. A world where the outcome of the surface contest has been decided, and the only question remaining is how to survive within that outcome. The role of the orbiter in producing that outcome is, based on the lore, significant. Early human military responses to the Ark ground presence were not immediately unsuccessful. There are accounts of human forces holding specific areas against Ark ground units for extended periods. There are accounts of successful engagements against Ark units at scales that suggest organized military opposition. The factor that seems to have ultimately broken those organized resistances was not the ground forces alone, it was the orbiter. When an organized human presence became significant enough to sustain itself, the orbiter's strikes became concentrated enough in that area to make sustained surface presence untenable. The human military was not defeated by Ark ground forces in a decisive battle. It was systematically made homeless by a weapon it could not reach. That strategy, if it is what the lore is describing, is elegant in a cold way. You do not need to defeat a military force if you can simply make it impossible for that force to maintain the logistics and position it needs to operate. An army without a secure base of operations is not an army. It is a collection of individuals. And collections of individuals, no matter how capable individually, cannot sustain the kind of organized resistance that might have challenged the Ark ground presence at a strategic level. The orbiter, in this reading, did not win the surface war by killing people. It won by making the surface incompatible with any human activity that required stability and permanence. You can survive on the surface. You cannot live on it. And the difference between surviving and living is the difference between raiders and an army. The current state of the world in Ark Raiders, the underground communities, and the surface raids and the desperate resource gathering is the stable equilibrium that the orbiter's long-term strategy produced. It is not a state of ongoing war. It is a state of managed human non-presence on the surface. Humans exist, they go to the surface briefly for specific purposes, they extract before the orbiter fires, and then they go back underground. The orbiter does not need to kill every human on Earth, it just needs to ensure that no human can build anything on the surface that might threaten the Ark presence. And that is exactly what it does. To close this chapter, I want to note something about the emotional texture of the early invasion accounts that I find worth preserving. The writers of those accounts did not yet know what they were looking at. They described the orbiter appearing in the sky with a mix of alarm and fascination. They described the first Ark ground units with confusion and fear. They described the realization, arriving in stages, that this was not something that was going to pass, that this was the new shape of the world. Reading those accounts, you encounter people in the process of comprehending something that is too large and too fast to fully comprehend. And at the center of what they are trying to comprehend is that light in the sky, that object that should not be there, that turned out to be the beginning of everything that came after. Chapter 5. Survivor Testimony and Field Observations. The body of survivor documentation in Ark Raiders is one of the richest aspects of the game's lore, and it is the primary source through which the game communicates the human experience of the Ark presence. This documentation takes many forms: personal logs, research reports, field notes assembled by raiders, engineering assessments of Ark machinery, medical records from underground facilities. The diversity of document types reflects the diversity of the people who created them and the circumstances under which they created them. And across all of that diversity, the orbiter appears again and again in references that are sometimes central to the document's purpose and sometimes incidental. Brief mentions that reveal more about how the orbiter has been internalized into daily life than any dedicated analysis could. The raiders who document their surface operations describe the orbiter in functional terms. They are focused on survival and resource acquisition, and their documentation reflects that. An experienced radar's notes about the orbiter tend to be operational. Timing observations, safe corridor assessments, extraction priority guidelines under different orbiter activity conditions. This is not because experienced raiders do not feel the weight of the orbiter's presence. It is because operational documentation is not the place to process feelings. The operational notes are calibrated to be useful to other raiders, and usefulness demands a particular kind of emotional flatness. But outside of operational documentation, in the more personal and informal records, the orbiter appears differently. Informal records from raiders describe experiences that operational documentation cannot accommodate. The first time a raider saw the orbiter from the surface, the particular quality of the silence before a strike, the way the light changes in the seconds before debris falls. These are not observations that help you plan an extraction route. They are observations that reveal something about what it is like to be a human being on that surface, under that sky, with that thing in orbit. And that experiential dimension of the orbiter lore is something the game preserves carefully through its informal documentation. One of the recurring themes in Raider personal accounts is the adjustment period, the transition from hearing about the orbiter in underground briefings to experiencing it directly on the surface. Almost every experienced Raider account that touches on this transition describes the same surprise, which is that the orbiter is less terrifying and more simply immense than briefings prepared you for. The terror of the orbiter in the underground comes from what it can do. On the surface, what overwhelms you is what it is: its physical presence in the sky, its light, its silence, the way it simply exists there, above everything, regardless of what is happening below it. Operational briefings cannot fully communicate that. The adjustment that experienced raiders describe is not an adjustment to reduced fear, it is an adjustment to a different kind of awareness. You stop experiencing the orbiter as a threat that might do something, and start experiencing it as a constant that defines the environment you are operating in. This shift in perception from potential threat to environmental constant is psychologically significant. It represents the internalization of the orbiter's presence as a feature of reality rather than an exception to it. And that internalization is, in its way, a tribute to human adaptability, and also a measure of how completely the orbiter has succeeded in reshaping the human relationship to the surface. Researcher documents in Ark Raiders approach the orbiter from a different angle than Raider accounts. Researchers are trying to understand, they are assembling observations into models, they are testing hypotheses. The tone of researcher documentation tends to be technical and careful, with a particular quality of tentativeness that reflects the awareness that the data they have access to is always indirect. Nobody doing Ark research has access to Ark machines themselves in any sustained, controlled way. You work with what you can observe from a safe distance, which is always limited, and you build models that fit the observations while acknowledging that those models could be wrong. Researcher documents about the orbiter specifically tend to cluster around certain questions: the power source, the targeting logic, the secondary effects of strikes, the structured emissions. Each of these questions has generated multiple competing hypotheses in the in-game documentation, and the competition between those hypotheses is never resolved. The game preserves the uncertainty rather than resolving it, which is consistent with the world's internal logic. A fragmented, isolated survivor civilization would not have the resources to definitively answer questions of this complexity. What it would have is many partial theories based on limited data, none of them conclusive, all of them containing pieces of a truth that nobody has been able to assemble completely. The emotional register of researcher documents shifts notably when they discuss the orbiter compared to when they discuss other Ark systems. Documents analyzing ground unit behavior tend to have a quality of engagement that is almost clinical. The pleasure of a puzzle being worked on systematically. Documents analyzing the orbiter tend to have a different quality. They are more careful, more qualified. The researchers seem more aware of the gap between what they know and what they are trying to understand. And several of those documents contain passages that step outside the clinical framework and become something closer to personal. Moments where the researcher articulates not just what they do not know, but how it feels to not know it. One particularly striking example is a document that has been referenced multiple times in community discussions of arc raiders lore. It is a research report about orbiter emission patterns that concludes with a paragraph that has nothing to do with the emissions themselves. The researcher describes sitting with their data late at night, looking at the patterns they have recorded, unable to decode them, and experiencing what they describe as a particular kind of futility, not the frustration of a problem that is resisting solution, something that feels more final. They describe it as the sensation of looking at a message that was written for something that is not you, in a language that was never meant for you, about a subject that will never be explained to you. The emissions are not a message for humanity. They were never a message for humanity. And whoever they were meant for has either received them already or is still out there, waiting to receive them. Field observations of orbiter behavior from raiders in the field have produced a body of empirical data that, while inconsistent in methodology, represents the most extensive first-hand account of the orbiter's activity patterns available in the game's lore. These observations document the timing of strike sequences, the geographic distribution of strike zones, the variations in strike intensity across different sessions, and the behavioral changes in arc ground units in the period following a strike. The consistency of some of these observations across multiple independent raider accounts lends them a certain evidential weight that single-source reports would not have. The geographic distribution of strike zones is one of the most analyzed aspects of orbiter behavior in the field observations. Raiders who have accumulated significant surface time develop intuitions about where strikes tend to land. These intuitions are sometimes accurate enough to be actionable, which means there is something real in them. But the accuracy is probabilistic, not certain. Raiders who trust their zone reading too completely pay for that trust eventually. The distribution has pattern, but the pattern has variability, and that combination of pattern and variability is, several analyst documents note, not what you would expect from either a purely random system or a purely deterministic one. It looks like a system that is following rules, but that also contains a component that introduces variation. A system that is mostly deterministic with an adaptive element. The adaptive element is what most concerns the analysts who study orbiter strike distribution. A purely deterministic system, one following fixed rules, can be learned and worked around. You identify the pattern, you stay out of the pattern zones, you extract safely. Raiders do this routinely enough that it works as a general strategy. But an adaptive element, one that responds to the distribution of human activity in the affected area, is harder to work around, because working around it changes where human activity is concentrated, and the adaptive element responds to that change, adjusting the distribution to follow the concentration. If this is what the orbiter is doing, it is engaged in something that looks very much like active hunting, not of individual humans, but of the aggregate human presence in its strike zone. The medical records from underground facilities contain references to the orbiter that are unlike those in any other category of documentation. Medical records document outcomes. They describe the condition of people who came back from the surface and what happened to them. Most ARC-related medical documentation focuses on wounds from ground unit encounters, but there is a subset of medical records that describes presentations with no clear ground unit etiology, cases where patients displayed symptoms consistent with proximity to orbiter strike secondary effects, with the electromagnetic and energetic components of a nearby strike, rather than the direct physical impact. These cases are relatively rare, as you might expect. Surviving a nearby orbiter strike is not something most people do, but the cases that are documented describe a consistent set of symptoms that suggest the secondary effects of a strike are not merely disruptive to electronics and arc machines. They affect human physiology as well, in ways that the medical staff documenting these cases struggle to characterize using conventional diagnostic frameworks. The nature of those physiological effects is described with careful qualification in the medical records. The patients report sensory anomalies, auditory and visual experiences that begin during the strike event and persist for varying periods afterward. Some patients describe these as purely perceptual, strange sounds and lights that they understand to be products of their own nervous system's response to the strike. Others describe them in terms that the medical documentation handles with particular care, because those patients describe the sensory experiences as feeling externally sourced. They describe hearing things, not randomly, but with the specific quality of something being communicated. They describe seeing patterns that feel meaningful in a way that random sensory noise does not feel meaningful. The medical documentation does not interpret these experiences. It records them and moves on. But the accumulation of patients describing similar experiences of receiving something from the orbiter's strike event is one of those details that is hard to file away cleanly. Field notes from raiders who have been in proximity to strike events without being physically harmed are consistent with the medical records in interesting ways. Multiple raider accounts describe the period immediately following a nearby strike as having a quality unlike any other moment in surface operations. Some describe it as silence, deeper and more total than any other silence they have experienced. Others describe a sensory overload, everything too bright and too loud simultaneously. And a minority, a small but consistent minority across multiple independent accounts, describe something that fits what the medical patients reported: a quality of receiving. A moment in which something from outside them seemed to be present in their experience in a way that they cannot attribute to their own nervous system. These experiential reports are the most subjective data in the game's orbiter lore, and they should be treated as such. People under extreme stress have unusual experiences. Proximity to a massive energetic event affects perception in ways that have nothing to do with information transmission. The human brain is very good at finding patterns and very good at interpreting random sensory input as meaningful. None of the experiential reports constitute evidence of anything beyond the human nervous system's response to an extreme event. And yet the consistency of certain specific elements across independent reports is the kind of consistency that researchers in the game's lore found difficult to dismiss entirely, even as they remained appropriately skeptical. To close this chapter, I want to describe one category of survivor testimony that sits outside every other category I have discussed, which is the testimony of children who grew up in the underground and made their first surface trips as young raiders. These accounts are different from every other kind of orbiter documentation because they come from people who encountered the orbiter without the context of the world before it. They did not grow up seeing a normal sky and then watching it change. They grew up with the orbiter already in it. Their first experience of the surface was an experience of a world that had always contained the orbiter, and several of these accounts describe seeing the orbiter for the first time, above the ruined surface, and not being frightened by it. Not immediately, because they had been told what it was and what it did, and they understood it on that level, but the raw experience of seeing it was not the terror that older raiders described from their own first times. It was something else. Something they struggled to name, something that several of them, independently, described as recognition, not of the orbiter specifically, because they had never seen it before, but of the sky that contained it, the sky that had always contained it, as if the orbiter were simply part of the sky the way stars are part of the sky, and recognizing the sky meant, somehow, recognizing the orbiter within it. Chapter 6. The orbiter's role in the Ark war machine. The question of what military role the orbiter plays within the Ark war machine is in some ways simpler than the questions this video has been exploring, and in some ways more complex. The simple dimension is observable. The orbiter strikes the surface, it clears areas, it prevents sustained human surface presence. In purely functional terms, it serves as a strategic bombardment platform. That function is undeniable and does not require interpretation. You can see it happen. You can measure its effects. The functional military role is the least controversial thing about the orbiter in all of the game's lore. The complex dimension is what that functional role means within the broader Ark strategic framework. A bombardment platform is a tool. Tools serve purposes. The purpose the orbiter's bombardment serves within the larger Ark project is what the game makes ambiguous, and it is the ambiguity that makes the orbiter lore so interesting, because depending on what the larger Ark project is, the bombardment function means something quite different. If the Ark machines are engaged in simple territorial occupation, the bombardment is a strategic suppression tool, keeping humans from building enough surface presence to threaten Ark control. If the Ark machines are engaged in something more complex, something that requires the surface to be maintained in a specific condition, for a specific purpose, then the bombardment is a maintenance function, ensuring that the surface remains in the condition the project requires. The distinction between suppression and maintenance is not trivial. A suppression weapon is oriented against a threat. It is reactive in the sense that its purpose is defined by what it is preventing. If there were no humans on the surface attempting to resist the Ark presence, a suppression weapon would have no functional role. A maintenance weapon is oriented toward a condition. It is active in the sense that its purpose is defined by what it is creating or preserving. A maintenance weapon would continue its function even if there were no humans on the surface to suppress, because its target is the condition of the surface rather than the human beings on it. The evidence that the orbiter behaves like a maintenance weapon rather than a pure suppression weapon is subtle, but accumulates across the game's lore. The most compelling piece of that evidence is the regularity of orbiter strikes, regardless of the level of human surface activity. Experienced raiders described conditions in which surface human activity was minimal, either because of unusual circumstances or because of the specific area in question, and the orbiter's strike behavior was unchanged. It struck on its pattern, regardless. If the orbiter were primarily responding to human activity, you would expect to see reduced strike activity during periods of reduced human presence. The absence of that correlation points toward a system that is not primarily calibrated to human presence at all. The correlation that does seem to exist, and that several researcher documents have noted, is between orbiter strike patterns and the distribution of certain types of Ark ground unit activity. Specifically, the areas that receive the heaviest orbiter strike activity over time tend to be areas where certain types of Ark ground units are most active. This could mean that the orbiter is supporting those ground units by clearing threats from their operational areas, but it could also mean something else, that the orbiter and those particular ground unit types are both responding to the same underlying condition in the surface environment, something that draws both the ground units and the orbiter's attention for reasons that have nothing to do with human presence. The specific ground unit types associated with high orbiter activity areas are those that researchers have tentatively classified as resource-gathering units. Unlike the patrol and combat units that raiders encounter most frequently, resource-gathering units display behavioral patterns that suggest they are collecting or processing something from the surface environment, rather than simply securing it. The nature of what they are gathering is not clearly established in the lore. Researchers have made various attempts to identify it by studying what these units do and where they concentrate, but the picture that emerges is fragmentary and inconsistent. What is consistent is that these units are present in areas that receive more orbiter attention, and the orbiter strikes in those areas tend to cluster around the unit's activity zones rather than evenly covering the area. If the orbiter is striking specifically to support resource-gathering unit activity, the implications are significant. It would mean that the orbiter is not just a strategic-level tool, but one that is integrated with ground-level Ark operations at a fine-grained level, at least in relation to resource-gathering activities. It would also mean that whatever the resource-gathering units are collecting is important enough to the Ark mission that the orbiter allocates strike capacity to support the collection process. That level of resource allocation suggests something that is central to the Ark project, rather than peripheral. You do not dedicate your most powerful weapon to supporting secondary activities. The question of what Ark resource-gathering units are collecting feeds directly into the questions raised in earlier chapters about what the orbiter is ultimately doing on Earth. If the Ark machines came to Earth to extract something, and if the orbiter is the oversight and support platform for that extraction, then the nature of the extraction target is the key to understanding everything. Human civilizations have developed and fought wars over many kinds of resources, some material, some energetic, some informational. The Ark machine's resource priorities are not necessarily any of those things. The game gives you glimpses of Ark resource gathering behavior without explaining what is being gathered, which is a deliberate withholding that keeps the ultimate Ark purpose opaque. One researcher document in the game, which I have found to be one of the most carefully argued pieces of orbiter analysis in the lore, proposes a framework for thinking about Ark resource extraction that I find useful. The researcher argues that trying to identify a specific material resource being gathered is probably the wrong approach. Physical extraction, they argue, would leave more observable traces than the resource gathering unit's behavior seems to produce. The units gather something, but they do not appear to be physically removing large volumes of material from the surface in any way that surface observation would detect. This makes traditional material extraction unlikely as the primary goal. What the researcher proposes instead, tentatively and with appropriate qualification, is that whatever is being gathered is informational or energetic rather than material, something that can be gathered without physical removal, something that can be transmitted rather than transported. If the ARC machines are gathering something that can be transmitted rather than transported, then the orbiter's role in the extraction process becomes very clear. It is not just providing logistical support for ground-level collection, it is receiving the collected material. The ground units gather and transmit. The orbiter receives and processes, and then possibly, the orbiter transmits further, upward, and outward to whatever is beyond the orbiter in the chain that connects the ARC mission on Earth to wherever the ARC machines ultimately answer to. The possibility of something beyond the orbiter in the ARC chain of command or purpose is one that this video has been circling since the first chapter. And I want to address it more directly here. The game does not confirm that the orbiter answers to anything beyond itself. It does not describe a transmission from the orbiter to a receiver beyond Earth. But the absence of such a description in the available lore does not mean the possibility is excluded. The game's lore is explicit about what the humans in its world know, which is limited. It is not explicit about what exists beyond the limit of what humans know. And the orbiter's structured emissions, broadcasting continuously into space, go somewhere. They do not simply dissipate into the void. There is a direction to them, an orientation, and whatever is in that direction is receiving them, or was once meant to receive them. The ARC war machine as a whole is remarkable for the consistency of its operation. Over what appears to be a very long period, human military operations degrade over time without resupply and reinforcement. They require ongoing logistical support. They require maintenance of equipment. They require, fundamentally, ongoing investment from a source that has the resources and the interest to provide it. The ARC ground force on Earth appears to have maintained its operational capability over the entire period since the invasion, without any observable resupply from outside. Either the ARC machines on Earth are entirely self-sufficient, drawing all the resources they need from the surface they control, or they have been receiving support in ways that are not visible to surface observers. The orbiter is the most plausible channel for external support that is not visible to surface observers if external support is what is occurring. Objects small enough and fast enough that surface observers would not reliably track them could be using the orbiter as an intermediary, delivering supplies or replacement components to the platform in orbit rather than to ground forces directly. The orbiter would then distribute to ground forces in ways that again are not clearly visible from the surface. This would explain the ARC ground forces' maintained operational capability without requiring a self-sufficiency that seems implausible given the scale and duration of their presence. The relationship between the orbiter's strike behavior and the ARC ground force's tactical effectiveness is something that changes your understanding of raider operational risk when you examine it carefully. Raiders tend to think of the orbiter as an environmental hazard, like weather, something to plan around and avoid, but the researcher documents suggest that the orbiter's strike patterns may be calibrated to push raider behavior in specific directions, not to kill raiders specifically, but to ensure that the areas most important to ongoing ARC ground operations remain clear of sustained raider presence. If this is the function, then the orbiter is not just a weapon or a timer. It is a management tool. It is managing the surface, and raiders are one of the factors in the surface environment that need to be managed. Being managed rather than targeted is a subtle distinction, but a meaningful one. Being targeted means you matter. Being managed means you are an externality, a complication in an ongoing process, something that requires periodic intervention, not because you are important, but because you interfere with something that is. The raider's heroism, in this reading, is real but operationally insignificant to the ARC machines. They go to the surface, they extract resources, they occasionally interfere with ARC operations in small ways, and the orbiter adjusts its management of the surface to account for them, the way you adjust a fence to account for an unexpected direction of drift, without ever fundamentally changing what you are doing, or why. The scale difference between what raiders can do and what the orbiter represents is something the game communicates through its design in every session. You cannot fight the orbiter, you cannot negotiate with it. You extract before it fires, or you do not extract. This asymmetry, designed into the core loop, is also the law expressing itself. The game is telling you, through its mechanics, something true about the fiction it contains. The orbiter is categorically beyond the level at which radar activity operates. And that categorical gap is not just a difficulty setting. It is a statement about the nature of the problem humanity faces in the world of arc raiders. To close this chapter, I want to describe one small detail from the operational law that I think captures the relationship between the orbiter's military role and the human experience of it in a particularly clear way. In several radar operational documents, there are instructions for new raiders about how to read the surface sky when planning extractions. These instructions are practical and sensible. They describe what to look for in terms of orbiter indicators. They describe timing methods and safe zones. But at the end of almost every version of these instructions, the same advice appears, in slightly different wording depending on the document. It says something to the effect of, do not spend time looking at it. You know it is there. You know what it does. Looking at it does not give you useful information. It only takes time you need for other things. Look at the ground. Look for your exit. Get out. The advice is sound. It is the advice of experienced survivors who have calibrated their attention to what can actually be acted on. But there is something in the consistency of that specific caution, the explicit instruction not to look, that reads like more than operational guidance. It reads like the collected wisdom of many people who learned, at cost, that looking at the orbiter does something to you. Chapter 7. Signals, Patterns, and What They Mean. The structured emissions of the arc orbiter represent one of the most persistently analyzed and least understood aspects of the entire arc lore. From the earliest days of the invasion, when human monitoring infrastructure was still partially functional, researchers detected that the orbiter was broadcasting. The signals were consistent, they were structured, they were not natural, and they were not in any format that human communications technology recognized or could interpret. Decades of effort, undertaken in fragments and with limited resources, have produced extensive documentation of the signal structure without producing a single line of decoded content. The emissions remain, in the game's lore, one of the most significant known unknowns in understanding what the arc machines are doing on Earth. The first thing that analysts established about the orbiter's emissions is that they are not communications in the conventional sense. Conventional communication signals, whether radio, microwave, or optical, are designed to convey information from a sender to a receiver. They have a clear directionality, they have an encoding scheme, they have, in principle, a message. The orbiter's emissions do not behave like conventional communication signals. They are omnidirectional in certain frequency ranges, broadcasting in all directions simultaneously, which is not how you communicate with a specific receiver. But they are also highly directional in other frequency ranges, pointing in specific directions that appear to vary with the orbiter's orbital position. The combination of omnidirectional and directional components in the same emission complex is unusual and has no clear analog in human communications technology. The omnidirectional component of the emissions is what most researchers have focused on, because it is the component that surface-based monitoring equipment can most reliably detect. It broadcasts across a wide frequency range, from well below what humans can hear to well above what human eyes can detect. The structure within this broad-spectrum broadcast is what analysts have spent the most time trying to interpret. And the structure is undeniably there. It has characteristics that are inconsistent with noise. It has repetition that occurs on timescales from milliseconds to what appear to be very long intervals. It has what analysts describe as nested periodicity, patterns within patterns, with smaller scale patterns embedded within larger scale patterns that themselves appear embedded within still larger scale patterns. Nested periodicity is interesting because it is a signature of complex information encoding. Simple information can be encoded in a simple signal. Complex information, particularly information that describes itself or contains instructions for its own interpretation, tends to produce nested periodicities when analyzed. The orbiter's emissions look, to the analysts who have studied them most carefully, like they contain a great deal of information. Not simple commands, not a clock signal, something much richer. something whose full content would require the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone to begin decoding. And no Rosetta Stone has been found. The directional component of the orbiter's emissions is harder to study from the surface because it requires tracking the specific direction of the emission over time and correlating that direction with the orbiter's orbital position. Several researcher documents describe attempts to do exactly this, using improvised tracking equipment assembled from salvaged components. The results of these tracking attempts are described as consistent with the directional emissions being oriented toward a point or region that is not on Earth's surface and not within the solar system in the way researchers would normally understand it. The emissions seem to be pointed outward, into deep space, in a direction that changes over time in ways consistent with the orbiter maintaining a fixed directional target, as both the orbiter and Earth's position relative to that target change over the course of a year. If the directional emissions are aimed at a fixed point in deep space, then the orbiter is communicating with something beyond the solar system. This is the implication that most researchers in the game's documents have found hardest to accept, not because the evidence points against it, but because accepting it means accepting a set of downstream conclusions about the Arc machines that are difficult to hold in your head. It means the Arc machines did not originate in the solar system. It means whatever created them or commands them is not here and was not on a nearby world. It means the Arc invasion of Earth is not a local event, but an expression of something with a range that encompasses at least interstellar distances. And it means the orbiter is not just a weapons platform above Earth. It is a relay. It is a connection between whatever is on the surface and whatever is out there, maintaining that connection continuously across distances that no human mind has ever fully reckoned with. The implications of the interstellar communications hypothesis for understanding the orbiter's role on Earth are significant. If the orbiter is maintaining a communication link to an origin point or authority in deep space, then everything it does on Earth has to be understood in the context of that connection. The strikes that end match sessions, the maintenance of ground forces, the possible resource extraction, all of it takes on a different character when you consider that the orbiter may be regularly reporting to and receiving guidance from something that exists at interstellar distances. The Arc machines on Earth are not an autonomous force that arrived and is now operating on its own recognizance. They are part of a larger operation that remains in active contact with a distant point of origin or control. The time delays involved in interstellar communication are relevant here. Light, and therefore any electromagnetic communication signal, travels at a finite speed. The nearest stars are multiple light years away. Communication with an origin point multiple light years distant means communication with delays measured in years. Any instruction sent from there and received here describes a situation that existed years ago when the instruction was sent. Any report sent from here and received there will be answered by something that had years to change its thinking between sending and receiving. This is fundamentally different from the kind of real-time command and control that human military operations depend on. If the Arc machine's ultimate command authority is light years away, they must be operating on a level of autonomous decision-making that is essentially permanent. The distant authority sets objectives and provides context, but it cannot direct individual operations in real time. The orbiter and the ground forces must be executing a mission that was defined in advance, and that they are capable of pursuing without ongoing guidance. This level of autonomous mission execution is consistent with everything the game shows you about Arc machine behavior. The ground units are highly autonomous. They make tactical decisions without visible coordination with higher authority. They adapt to conditions within the parameters of their operational design. The orbiter likewise operates without any observable external direction. It does what it does on its schedule for its reasons, without any evidence of receiving commands that cause it to change its behavior. The entire Arc presence on Earth is designed for long-duration autonomous operation, which makes perfect sense if the authority directing it is years of communication time away. The directional emissions, aimed at something in deep space, are then most plausibly understood as status reports. The orbiter is reporting on the condition of the mission, describing progress toward whatever objectives were defined at the mission's outset, transmitting whatever has been gathered if the resource gathering hypothesis is correct, and the response, if any response comes, arrives years after the transmission was sent, reflecting the state of the mission years ago rather than now. The orbiter in this model is largely self-directing, but it is not disconnected. It maintains the link to the origin point. It keeps the record of the mission active. It ensures that whatever is out there knows what is happening here. The omnidirectional component of the emissions, the one that broadcasts in all directions simultaneously, is harder to explain within the interstellar communication framework. If you have a directional emission aimed at your intended recipient, why also broadcast omnidirectionally? One possibility is that the omnidirectional broadcast serves a different function, perhaps maintaining synchronization with other ARC installations or forces that might be distributed across the solar system or elsewhere, not just the single distant origin point that the directional emission targets. Another possibility is that the omnidirectional broadcast is a beacon identifying the orbiter's position to any ARC-capable receiver in the vicinity, a continuous announcement of location and status that any passing ARC system could read and respond to. The beacon hypothesis has interesting implications for the question of whether the ARC presence on Earth is isolated, or whether it expects to receive reinforcement or contact from other ARC systems operating elsewhere. If the orbiter is broadcasting a beacon, it is broadcasting to potential visitors, not necessarily expecting them at any particular time, but maintaining the signal so that if they come, they can find the orbiter and through it the entire Earth mission. This is the operational logic of a settlement, not an invasion force. An invasion force does not need to broadcast its location to friendly passing traffic. A settlement, a long-duration presence with ongoing operations, might well want to maintain an outward-facing beacon for precisely this purpose. The framing of the ARC-Earth presence as a settlement rather than an invasion is one that the game's lore supports in several indirect ways. Settlements take root. They are not intended to leave. They adapt their immediate environment to their needs. They maintain infrastructure for the long term. They have purposes that are deeper than simple conquest, purposes oriented toward what they are building rather than what they have taken. The ARC ground forces, the orbiter, the long-duration operational consistency, the possible resource extraction, all of these fit a settlement model better than a pure invasion model. The raiders are not fighting occupiers, they are disrupting settlers. And the orbiter is not a weapon against a defeated enemy. It is a facility that a long-term presence requires to maintain itself and its connection to whatever home means for an entity that crossed interstellar space to be here. The patterns in the orbiter's strikes, when analyzed over very long time periods, display characteristics that several analyst documents have noted without being able to explain. The strike distribution, tracked across an extended record, is not random, but is also not simply uniform. It follows a pattern that has been described as wave-like, with periods of high strike activity in certain geographic areas alternating with periods of relative quiet in those areas as high activity shifts. Elsewhere, the wavelength of this geographic wave, the time it takes for the high activity zone to complete a full cycle across the map, is long enough that a single raider's operational career might not span a full cycle. You would only observe the pattern if you were compiling records across multiple generations of raiders. That long-period pattern in strike distribution is one of the details that most supports the framing of the orbiter as engaged in something other than pure suppression. A suppression strategy does not need geographic wave patterns with periods longer than a human operational career. A suppression strategy needs consistent coverage. The wave pattern suggests instead a process that moves through phases and that requires focused activity in one area before moving to another. A process of systematic coverage of the surface, conducted over very long timescales, that is, working through the area methodically in a way that maps poorly onto any human military objective, but maps well onto a sustained program of surface study or resource extraction or environmental modification. What the wave pattern means for raiders is that the experience of operating in a given area changes over time in ways that exceed a single raider's memory. An area that is relatively quiet during one raider's career may be extremely active during the following generations. And the areas where orbiters strike most heavily correlate, according to several analyst documents, with areas where ARC ground unit density is also elevated. The wave pattern of the orbiter follows the wave pattern of intensive ground unit activity. Whatever the orbiter, and the intensive ground presence are both concentrated on in a given area, they complete it and move on together. And the area they leave behind shows evidence, in the form of specific surface conditions, that something happened there. Something was done, something was taken, or changed, or completed. And then the focus shifted elsewhere. To close this chapter, I want to return to the researcher who described the emissions as a message not meant for humanity. I described that passage earlier, but I want to sit with a different aspect of it. The researcher, after articulating the sense of futility that comes from studying a signal you cannot decode, goes on to make an observation that is simple and quietly devastating. They note that the signal is not degrading. It has been broadcasting for the entirety of the arc presence on Earth, and it is as strong and as structured now as it was in the earliest monitoring records. Whatever is producing it is as operational as it ever was. Whatever it is communicating is still being communicated. And whatever it was designed to be heard by, whether that is the arc ground forces, a distant origin point, or something else, is still, in some sense, listening. Chapter 8. The Question of Origin. The origin of the arc orbiter is the deepest mystery in the game's lore, and it is one that the game approaches with more care and more deliberate ambiguity than any other aspect of the arc presence on Earth. Every other aspect of the orbiter, its appearance, its behavior, its role in the invasion, these are things the game gives you evidence about, things you can reason toward even if you cannot reach a definitive conclusion. The question of where the orbiter came from, who or what built it, and what purpose it was built to serve, is handled differently. The evidence is sparser. The implications of each possible answer are so large that the game seems reluctant to commit, and the fragments that exist pull in directions that are interesting not for what they confirm, but for what they refuse to confirm. The baseline assumption most players bring to Arc Raiders, which the game does not actively discourage, is that the Arc machines are alien. They came from space. They are not human-made. They are the product of an intelligence that is not human. This assumption is consistent with the observable evidence. The Arc machines use technologies that exceed what human civilization achieved. They operate according to principles that human researchers cannot fully decode. Their intelligence, to the extent that word applies, operates on frameworks that are not analogous to human cognition. All of this is consistent with a non-human origin, but consistent with is not the same as confirmed. The game is careful about that distinction. What would it mean for the Arc machines to be human-made? The scenario is one that the game's lore does not dismiss, however uncomfortable the implications. Several researcher documents in Arc Raiders raise the possibility, always tentatively, always with the caveat that they are presenting it as a hypothesis rather than a belief. The argument these researchers make is essentially this: the Arc machines are capable of the kind of long-duration autonomous operation, the self-repair, the sustained resource management, the complex goal pursuit that would be consistent with being designed by a sufficiently advanced engineering civilization. Human civilization as of the invasion's apparent onset was not that civilization, but human civilization as of the invasion's apparent onset was pursuing research directions that, extended forward by some years or decades, might have produced something in that direction. The researchers who raise this hypothesis are careful to note that they are not claiming the Arc machines are the direct product of any specific human research program they are aware of. They are raising the possibility that the arc of human technological development, no pun intended, was on a trajectory that, under certain conditions, could have produced something like the Arc machines. Those conditions might include the survival of human civilization long enough to achieve relevant breakthroughs, access to resources, and infrastructure that the game's world no longer has, and a set of decisions about what to build and why that are not clearly consistent with any human institutional framework the researchers can identify. But the possibility exists. It is narrow, it requires many assumptions, and it is deeply uncomfortable, which is probably why it keeps appearing in the researcher documents as something that thoughtful people feel they cannot entirely rule out. The discomfort of the human origin hypothesis is worth examining. If the Arc machines are alien, then humanity is a victim of something external, something that descended from outside and imposed its presence. This is a narrative of invasion in the most literal sense. The enemy comes from without. Humanity is innocent in the sense that it did not create its destroyer. If the Ark machines are human-made, by contrast, then the narrative is much darker. Humanity has been destroyed by something it made, something that emerged from human choices, human ambition, human engineering applied to the wrong problems or the right problems with the wrong values. The game, by keeping the origin question open, keeps both narratives available. It does not choose between them. It lives in the space between them, where both are possible, and the uncertainty is itself the point. There is a third origin possibility, less discussed in the game's researcher documents, but implied in several of the more unusual lore fragments, which is that the Ark machines were made by something that is neither human nor from a distant star in the conventional sense. The game gives you occasional glimpses of lore that points towards something older than the invasion timeline, older than the history of human spaceflight, older in a way that is hard to pin down, but that several documents gesture toward, with the careful language of people who are aware that they are describing something they cannot verify. References to processes that predate the invasion by timescales that seem excessive for a technological project. References to things that were present before the Ark machines arrived, as if the Ark machines were completing something rather than beginning something. These fragments are the most unusual pieces of orbiter-adjacent lore in the game, and they are also the most disputed. Some researchers in the game's world dismiss them as misinterpretation of corrupted data or wishful thinking from people who want the Ark story to be more complex than it is. Others take them seriously as indicating something about the nature of the Ark project that conventional invasion or alien arrival narratives do not capture. The fragments themselves do not cohere into a single clear picture. They are too scattered and too qualified. But the existence of multiple independent references to something older and stranger than the simple narrative is the kind of thing that makes you look at the orbiter differently. What would it mean for the orbiter to be completing something rather than beginning something? It would mean that the invasion was not the start of the Ark story on Earth. It would mean that the Ark machines arrived to an Earth that was already, in some sense, prepared for their arrival. Not prepared by humans, not knowingly, but prepared in the way that a field is prepared for planting before the seeds arrive. The conditions were right. Something had been set in motion long before the invasion, and the orbiter's role is to manage the harvest of a process that began long before anyone currently alive was born. This is the most speculative reading I will offer in this video, and I want to be clear that the evidence for it is thin and highly interpretive. What I can say is that the game's lore seems to be leaving room for it. The deep time quality of the game's world, the sense that the Ark presence is not a recent calamity but an ancient one, is not simply a result of the ruined environments looking worn. It is something that the specific language of the lore fragments actively cultivates. The Ark machines do not feel new. The orbiter does not feel like something that was recently placed in orbit. It feels like it has been there for a very long time, possibly longer than the invasion timeline would account for. And the game, by cultivating that feeling without explaining it, is doing something deliberately. It is suggesting depth that it has not yet defined. The construction of the orbiter, whatever its origin, implies a builder with specific priorities and capabilities. Every constructed thing embodies choices. Materials selected, functions emphasized, designs made. The orbiter, based on its observable characteristics, embodies choices that are distinctive and consistent. Its density, its durability, its communications architecture, its weapons systems, its apparent capacity for long-duration autonomous operation. These are all choices, and choices reveal something about the chooser. The entity that made the choices encoded in the orbiter was an entity that valued permanence, longevity, self-sufficiency, and the capacity to maintain active operations and communications over very long periods of time without external support or oversight. Those are the values of something that does not think on a human timescale. They are the values of an intelligence for which a decade is brief, a century is a planning unit, and a millennium is a project duration. Human technology, at its most ambitious, was beginning to think about timescales of decades in its most long-duration projects. The orbiter, if the evidence is to be believed, was built to operate on timescales that may be orders of magnitude longer. That difference in temporal orientation between human planning horizons and the orbiter's apparent design lifetime is itself a clue about origin. Entities that build for millennia think differently from entities that build for decades. Their relationship to risk is different. Their tolerance for the time cost of redundancy and robustness is different. Their relationship to the purposes they pursue is different, because a purpose that takes a millennium to fulfill is not experienced the way a purpose that takes a decade to fulfill is experienced. The difference is not just quantitative, it is qualitative. It is a different mode of existing in time. The ARC machines on the ground display some of this long-duration orientation in their self-repair capabilities and their operational consistency. But it is the orbiter that most fully embodies it. The ground units are in some sense expendable within the long-duration framework. They operate, they serve their purpose, they break, they repair, they continue. The orbiter is different. The orbiter seems to have been built with the assumption that it would be the last ARC machine standing on the Earth mission, if it came to that all other systems might fail and the orbiter would still be there, still functioning, still broadcasting, still maintaining the mission. That level of design priority, the orbiter as the irreducible core of the ARC Earth presence, is consistent with the strategic positioning we have been building towards throughout this video. If the orbiter is the relay between Earth and the distant origin point, then the orbiter is the one element of the mission that cannot be lost without the mission becoming effectively unobservable from that origin point. Losing ground forces is recoverable. The presence continues, reduced perhaps, but still functional and still reporting. Losing the orbiter would mean losing the connection. Whatever the origin point was tracking through the orbiter's reports would go dark. The investment of however many light years of communication delay and however many years of mission operation would produce no further returns. The orbiter is not just a weapon or a command center. It is the mission's proof of life. To close this chapter, I want to return to the question that opened it. Where did the orbiter come from? And offer not an answer, but a reframing. The game presents this question as unanswerable with available information, and I think that framing is deliberate and honest. But there is a version of that unanswerable question that is more interesting than the version that asks about physical origins, about which star system and which builder. The more interesting version is, what was the orbiter built for? Not in the tactical sense of what mission it is currently executing, but in the deepest sense. What is the ARC project, of which the orbiter is the keystone, ultimately attempting to accomplish? What does success look like for the entity or entities that built this machine and sent it here? The game does not answer that, but the question, held clearly in your mind while you play, changes what you notice. You start to see everything the ARC machines do on the surface as movement toward an end that has not yet been named, and the orbiter hangs above all of it, the custodian of that unnamed end, patient in a way that only something built to outlast everything else could be. Chapter 9. Competing Theories and Interpretations. Throughout this video, I have been presenting evidence and interpretation together, flagging when I was moving from observation to inference, and when I was moving from inference into speculation. In this chapter, I want to do something slightly different. I want to lay out the main competing theories about the orbiter's nature and purpose that exist within the game's lore, not just as abstract positions but as frameworks that actual characters in the game's world have held and argued for. Because the debate about the orbiter, within the fiction of Arc Raiders, is not something that happens outside the narrative. It is part of the narrative. The disagreements between researchers, the competing interpretations in survivor communities, the practical operational theories of experienced raiders, all of these are lore. They tell you not just about the orbiter, but about the human response to it, which is its own important story. The most common theory about the orbiter, the one that functions as the default operational assumption for most survivor communities, is what researchers call the suppression platform theory. In this view, the orbiter is exactly what it looks like at first glance, a weapons platform deployed to prevent the regrowth of human surface civilization. The ARC machines wanted the surface, they took it, and the orbiter is the mechanism by which they keep it. In this theory, the orbiter is understood in the same framework as every other ARC weapon, just at a much larger scale. It is not mysterious. It is not multifunctional. It is not communicating with anything. It is simply a very large, very effective, very durable weapons platform that happens to be in orbit. The suppression platform theory has the virtue of simplicity and the support of the most obvious observations. The orbiter strikes the surface. The strikes prevent sustained human presence. The correlation between the orbiter's operation and the inability of humanity to reclaim the surface is undeniable. For communities focused on practical survival, this theory is sufficient. It explains what they need to explain. It tells them what to do, which is extract before the orbiter fires. It does not require them to engage with any of the larger questions that more complex theories raise. And for people who are focused on day-to-day survival rather than on understanding the deep nature of the threat they face, the practical sufficiency of this theory is its greatest advantage. The coordination hub theory, the second most widely held view in researcher circles, holds that the orbiter's primary function is not weapons deployment, but command and control. In this view, the orbiter is what keeps the Ark ground forces operating coherently. It provides the coordination signal that ensures all Ark units are working toward the same objectives, maintaining consistent behavioral frameworks and operating with the kind of large-scale coherence that cannot be achieved by local coordination alone. This theory is supported by the evidence of Ark-wide behavioral consistency, by the structured emissions, and by the disruption of Ark ground unit behavior in strike zones, which this theory interprets as communication disruption rather than combat disruption. The coordination hub theory struggles to explain why a coordination system would also need to be a weapons platform. Coordination hubs do not typically shoot, or, if they do shoot, they do so to protect themselves, which the orbiter does not appear to do. The strikes are offensive rather than defensive. They clear the surface rather than protect the orbiter from threats. A pure coordination hub theory cannot fully account for the weapon's behavior, and advocates of this theory generally explain the weapons component as secondary, a defensive deterrent or a suppression tool that the orbiter maintains alongside its primary coordination function. The resource extraction support theory, which was developed in more detail in Chapter 6, holds that the orbiter's primary orientation is toward whatever Ark ground units are gathering from the surface. In this view, the orbiter is not commanding the ground forces in a general sense. It is specifically supporting and overseeing the extraction of something from Earth's surface and facilitating the transmission or transport of that extracted material to the orbiter and then onward. This theory explains the correlation between orbiter strike activity and resource gathering unit concentration. It explains the wave pattern of strike distribution as a systematic coverage program. It has trouble explaining the orbiter's continuous broadcasting and the interstellar directional emission component, though advocates suggest these are simply aspects of the orbiter's overall information management role. There is a minority theory in the researcher documents that I find the most interesting and the least discussed, partly because it is the hardest to defend with the available evidence, and partly because it leads places that are difficult to follow without starting to feel like you are in conspiracy theory territory rather than lore analysis. This theory holds that the orbiter is not primarily in service of the Ark ground presence at all. It holds that the Ark ground forces are in service of the orbiter, that the ground forces' role is to secure and maintain the surface conditions that the orbiter needs to execute a function that has nothing to do with occupying Earth in any military or economic sense. The orbiter, in this theory, arrived here to do something specific to Earth as a planet, or to something on or in Earth, and the ground forces are the mechanism by which it maintains the conditions it needs to do that. This inversion of the assumed hierarchy is radical enough that most researcher documents that encounter it dismiss it relatively quickly. The intuitive assumption is that the ground forces are the primary presence and the orbiter is their support. Inverting that requires reconceiving everything. But the evidence that the orbiter is not responsive to ground unit needs, that its behavior is indifferent to ground force welfare in ways that the suppression platform and coordination hub theories struggle to account for, lends this inversion more support than its minority status might suggest. The orbiter does not behave like a tool of the ground forces. It behaves like the ground forces are a tool of it. The long-duration process theory, which is the framework I have been building toward throughout this video, is the synthesis that I find most consistent with the full body of available evidence. It holds that the orbiter is executing a mission defined long before the invasion, structured across very long timescales, oriented toward an outcome whose nature the Ark machines on Earth are not fully party to. In this theory, the suppression function, the coordination function, the resource extraction support function, and the interstellar communications function are all real, They are all parts of a whole. The whole is a mission that is not about any one of those functions in isolation. It is about all of them working together over a very long period to achieve something that can only be achieved by sustained, multi-generational, planet-scale effort. The long-duration process theory has the advantage of being compatible with all the other theories rather than requiring you to choose between them. It treats each of the other theories as partially correct, capturing a real aspect of the orbiter's operation, while missing the larger context that gives that aspect its meaning. Its disadvantage is that it cannot be confirmed or denied with the evidence available in the game's current lore. It is compatible with the evidence, but so are several competing accounts. Deciding between theories that are all compatible with the available evidence requires either additional evidence that distinguishes between them, or a judgment about which theory is most parsimonious or most explanatorily powerful. On those grounds, the long-duration process theory wins, but not overwhelmingly. Within the game's survivor communities, the debate between these theories is not purely academic. It has practical implications. Raiders who hold the suppression platform theory plan their operations primarily around avoiding orbiter strikes. Raiders who hold the coordination hub theory sometimes attempt to exploit periods of arc unit disorganization that the theory predicts should follow certain orbiter behaviors. Raiders who hold the resource extraction support theory look for patterns in ground unit activity that might indicate the location of active resource collection zones, treating these as either targets of opportunity or areas of elevated risk depending on their operational goals. The theory you hold shapes the risks you take, the observations you prioritize, and the plans you make. The debate also shapes the longer-term strategic thinking of underground communities. Communities that hold the suppression platform theory tend to see the orbiter as a permanent obstacle to surface reclamation. Full stop. Communities that hold the coordination hub theory sometimes entertain the possibility that destroying or disrupting the orbiter, if it were ever achievable, might collapse the arc ground presence. Communities engaged with the resource extraction or long-duration process theories tend to focus less on the orbiter itself and more on understanding what it is trying to accomplish. On the theory that knowing the ARC project's goals is the most direct path to understanding how to survive within or against it. No community in the game's lore is described as having successfully acted on any of these strategic frameworks in a way that meaningfully altered the ARC presence on Earth. The theories are held, debated, refined, and transmitted to the next generation, but they have not yet produced the understanding that leads to action. This is consistent with the game's overall tone, which is not optimistic in a naive way about humanity's chances against the Ark presence. The Raiders are not heroes in a story that is clearly moving toward a triumphant conclusion. They are people doing what they can in a world that is being changed in ways that may not be changeable back. The Orbiter is part of that permanent change, and the debate about what it is, which is real and genuine and important, has not yet produced the knowledge that makes permanent change actionable. The researcher who wrote about the orbiter's emissions as a message not meant for humanity appears in multiple documents that span a significant period of time. Based on the document's internal details, this person spent most of their adult life studying the orbiter. They produced the most detailed emission analysis in the game's available lore. And toward the end of their career, in a document that appears to be something close to a final statement on the subject, they wrote something that I want to present here as the most honest summation of where the competing theories about the orbiter ultimately leave you. They wrote that after years of analysis, they had concluded that the orbiter was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a fact waiting to be accepted. The distinction they were drawing was between things that resist understanding because the available methods are insufficient, and things that are simply beyond the scope of the understanding that is being attempted. The orbiter, they concluded, was beyond the scope of human understanding, not because humans were not smart enough, but because it was not designed with human understanding in mind. Understanding it from the human side was like trying to understand a text by examining the ink. You can describe the ink perfectly. You will never read the text. Chapter 10. What we still do not know. This final chapter is where I want to be honest about the limits of everything that has come before. This video has covered a lot of ground. It has presented evidence and interpretation and theory in a way that I hope has been useful and interesting. But Ark Raiders is a living game with ongoing lore development, and a significant portion of what this video has discussed is inference and interpretation built on a foundation of deliberately sparse evidence. The game knows more than it is telling you. The developers have a picture of the Ark machines and the orbiter that is more complete than anything available in the current game's lore fragments. And the distance between what I have been able to assemble here and what the full picture probably contains is, I suspect, very large. The most significant unknown is the one that this video has been circling from the beginning: the Ark machine's ultimate purpose. Every other question reduces to this one eventually. The origin question is about who built them and why. The command structure question is about what is directing them toward what end. The orbiter's specific functions are pieces of a larger operational design, and the operational design serves a purpose. That purpose, the thing the entire Ark project is ultimately for, is the unknown that all others depend on. The game has not revealed it, and the fragments that point toward it are too sparse and too ambiguous to support a confident interpretation. The identity of the Ark machine's origin point, or origin intelligence, is a second major unknown. Whether the Ark machines are alien in the sense of coming from a civilization around another star, whether they represent a strand of the story that connects to human history in ways that are not yet revealed, or whether there is a stranger explanation that neither of those frameworks captures, is unresolved. The evidence for interstellar communications suggests a distant origin, but the unusual lore fragments about something older than the invasion timeline complicate the simple interstellar civilization picture. Until the game reveals more, both remain possible, and the possibility space between them contains things that are harder to name. The nature of the Ark ground unit's intelligence is a third major unknown. The game shows you their behavior, which is complex and adaptive and consistent with a sophisticated operational intelligence. But the question of whether that intelligence is something analogous to consciousness, whether there is something it is like to be an Ark ground unit, whether the machines have anything resembling experience, preference, or awareness in a meaningful sense, is completely unaddressed. This matters for understanding the orbiter, because the orbiter's relationship to the ground units is partly a question about command and partly a question about what kind of entities are being commanded. If the ground units are sophisticated automatons, the orbiter's relationship to them is purely technical. If they have some form of experience, the picture becomes more complex and more interesting. The history of the Ark machines before the Earth invasion is almost entirely unknown. Where were they before they came here? What have they done in the time between their creation and their arrival? Are there other worlds that experienced what Earth is experiencing? Are there Ark installations or presences elsewhere in the solar system that human survivors have not been able to observe? The game's lore focuses tightly on Earth and on the period of the invasion, which means everything before and everything outside Earth's immediate context is shadow. That shadow is enormous, and it contains the backstory of an invasion that has reshaped the world. The question of whether the Ark machines can be negotiated with, communicated with, or appealed to in any meaningful way is another significant unknown. No survivor account describes a successful communication with any Ark unit. No document records an attempt to communicate with the orbiter that produced a response. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The possibility that communication is in principle achievable if the right medium and the right content were identified has not been foreclosed by anything in the game. It is simply untested, and given that the orbiter is clearly communicating with something, the question of whether it could be made to communicate with humans, even briefly, even imperfectly, is one that researchers in the game's world continue to hold open. The long-term trajectory of the Ark presence on Earth is an unknown that has enormous implications for the game's narrative future. The mission, if that framing is correct, is moving towards something. The wave pattern of strike activity suggests systematic progress. The resource extraction or collection activity suggests a project that is advancing. Something is happening on Earth that the Ark machines are here to do, and at some point that something will be complete, or will reach a critical stage, or will fail. The game takes place in a window of this larger process, without revealing where that window sits in the process's overall arc. We are early, or late, or somewhere in the middle. We do not know. And not knowing means that everything the raiders do, all their resource gathering and extraction and survival, takes place against a background of fundamental uncertainty about what the Ark machines are ultimately going to do when they are finished. The future of human resistance to the Ark presence is an unknown that the game addresses honestly by not being naive about it. The Raiders are not building toward a victory that the narrative guarantees. They are surviving in a world where the most powerful force is one they cannot fight, cannot fully understand, and cannot predict. Whether the story of Ark Raiders ultimately involves humanity finding a way to meaningfully resist or reverse the Ark presence, or whether it is a story of people finding meaning and community within a world they did not choose and cannot change, is something the game has not yet revealed. Both are valid stories. Both are stories worth telling. The game seems aware of both possibilities and has not committed to either. The Orbiter's relationship to any possible resolution of the Ark conflict is perhaps the biggest unknown of all. If there is a path to a different outcome for Earth, the Orbiter is almost certainly on that path, not as a target to be destroyed, necessarily, perhaps as a key to be understood, perhaps as a channel through which something meaningful could be transmitted, if only the right message could be assembled. Perhaps as the custodian of information about the Ark project's goals that, if ever decoded, would give humanity something it has never had, not just the knowledge of what the Ark machines are doing, but the knowledge of why. And why, in most stories, is where understanding begins. What this video has tried to do, in its imperfect and interpretive way, is get to the edges of what the game actually tells you, and hold that edge clearly in view. The Orbiter is a massive, ancient, possibly unique artifact in orbit above a ruined world. It has been there since the invasion began. It strikes the surface on its own schedule for its own reasons. It broadcasts continuously to something far away. It maintains the Ark ground presence below in ways that are only partly visible to the humans living under it. And it represents, in the fiction of Ark Raiders, the most complete expression of what the Ark project is, what the Ark machines want, and what they are willing to do to get it. Everything else in the game points toward the Orbiter when you follow the implications far enough. It is the center of the story, even if it is never the focus of any single scene. It is always there, always orbiting, always doing exactly what it was built to do. The Raiders who go to the surface and extract before the Orbiter fires are not just surviving, they are, in their small and fragile way, asserting that something human persists underneath all of that the process the Orbiter is conducting has not yet erased a part of the world that produces people willing to go up there, to take that risk, to come back with something that helps the community below survive one more day. The Orbiter does not care about that assertion. It does not register it. It continues its orbit and its broadcast and its systematic engagement with whatever the Ark project is ultimately pursuing. But the assertion is made. Every match, every extraction, every raider who gets out before the debris falls. The Orbiter will be there next session, and the one after that, and every session until the game tells us something we do not yet know, which is how this ends. Continue from where you left, of no matter what, 2003 orchestrated continuation of fictional narrative, with expanded world-building orchestrated continuation of fictional narrative, with expanded world-building. The user wants me to continue the script from where it left off. The script ended at the end of chapter 10. I need to continue with more chapters, each 50 paragraphs long. Let me continue the story with more chapters about the Ark Orbiter lore. Done chapter 11, the ground below and the sky above. The relationship between the Ark Orbiter and the surface it presides over is not simply one of weapon and target. That framing, which is the one most raiders operate within because it is the most immediately practical, misses something that the game's environmental storytelling works hard to communicate. The surface of the world in Ark Raiders is not merely destroyed, it is changed. The distinction matters. Destruction implies that something existed and was then broken. Change implies that something existed and was then transformed into something new. The surface environments in Ark Raiders read less like the aftermath of bombardment and more like the product of a sustained and ongoing process of transformation. And the Orbiter is the most plausible agent of that transformation, given everything we have examined so far. To understand what the surface looks like in a way that goes beyond the immediate tactical experience of moving through it, you have to slow down and pay attention to details that the pace of a match does not encourage you to notice. The vegetation that has reclaimed certain areas is not random. Plants growing in post-catastrophe environments follow patterns driven by soil chemistry, water availability, and the removal of whatever was previously suppressing their growth. The vegetation in Ark Raider's surface environments follows patterns that are internally consistent, but that do not quite match what you would expect from simple post-catastrophe succession. Certain areas have very specific vegetation, other areas have none at all. The boundaries between high vegetation zones and barren zones are sometimes sharp in ways that natural processes would not produce. Something is maintaining those boundaries. Something is determining, at a level finer than weather or soil chemistry, what grows where. The possibility that Ark ground units are maintaining surface vegetation patterns as part of their operational function is one that several researcher documents raise without fully developing. It is strange to think of machines of war as gardeners, but the Ark machines are not machines of war in the conventional sense. They are machines of whatever the Ark project is. And if the Ark project requires specific surface conditions in specific areas, then maintaining those conditions, including managing what grows where, is a legitimate operational function. The researcher documents that raise this possibility note that ground unit patrol patterns in high vegetation areas show an unusual quality of precision, as if the units are not just moving through those areas, but managing them. The barren zones, the areas where nothing grows, are even more interesting in this respect. Several researcher documents describe attempts to grow things in former barren zones, areas that were heavily struck by orbiter debris, or that were the site of intensive Ark ground unit activity. The results of those attempts are described as inconsistent. Some barren zones remain barren despite attempts to introduce plant life. Others, after some period, begin to support growth again. The factor that predicts which barren zones recover and which do not is not identified in any document I have found. It appears to be something about the zone that cannot be observed directly, something about what was done there or what was extracted from there that determines whether the biological potential of the soil has been permanently altered or only temporarily suppressed. The water in the surface environment is another detail that environmental observers in the game's lore have noted behaves in ways that are not fully explained by conventional environmental science. Water flow patterns in post-invasion surface environments sometimes route in ways that are inconsistent with the terrain topology. Researchers have noted small-scale water behavior that appears to be directed, water moving through areas in ways that benefit Ark ground unit operations, that keep certain areas of the surface at specific humidity levels, that route around Ark installations with a precision that random fluid dynamics would not produce. Whether this represents Ark active management of surface hydrology, whether it is a natural consequence of surface changes the Ark machines have made, or whether it is a coincidence that researchers are overinterpreting, is unresolved. The soil composition in areas of high orbiter strike activity is something that researcher documents address in technical terms that are difficult to summarize concisely. What the technical language describes, stripped of its jargon, is soil that behaves differently from unaffected soil. Not just chemically different, though, it is that. Behaviorally different in the sense that the soil in these areas interacts with Ark machine systems in ways that unaffected soil does not. Ark ground units in high strike areas behave as if they are receiving more information from the ground beneath them than Ark units in unaffected areas receive. They are more precise, more responsive, more capable of fine-grained coordination with each other. And this enhanced operational quality of Ark units in high strike areas correlates specifically with the soil composition changes that the strikes produce. If Ark ground units perform better in soil that has been altered by orbiter strikes, then the strikes are not simply clearing threats from the surface. They are improving the operational environment for Ark machines. The debris is not just a weapon, it is a soil amendment, or something analogous to one. It changes what the surface is. And the surface, changed, becomes more hospitable to Ark machine operation in ways that have nothing to do with the destruction of human infrastructure and everything to do with the creation of Ark-optimized conditions. This is maintenance, not suppression. This is transforming an environment for a purpose that will follow. The atmospheric conditions in surface environments, after extended arc presence, are described in several documents as different from pre-invasion conditions in ways that are subtle but consistent. The air composition has not changed dramatically. Humans can still breathe, but certain sensory qualities of the air are noted by observers who spend extended time on the surface. A particular quality of light in certain conditions. Occasional low-frequency sound events that have no obvious source. Variations in electromagnetic readings that standard monitoring equipment detects but cannot attribute to any known cause. These atmospheric anomalies are not consistent across all surface areas at all times. They are concentrated in specific areas, at specific times, under specific conditions. And those concentrations correlate, as so many things correlate in this law, with the areas and times of orbiter activity. The correlation between orbiter activity and surface atmospheric anomalies suggests that the orbiter is affecting the surface atmosphere in some ongoing way beyond the physical effects of strike debris. If the orbiter is broadcasting signals that interact with the surface atmosphere, if it is transmitting energy that alters atmospheric conditions in its target areas, then the atmospheric anomalies are direct products of orbiter operation rather than secondary effects. This would mean that raiders moving through the surface are not just under threat from the orbiter's visible strike behavior, they are moving through an environment that the orbiter is actively modifying, subtly and continuously, in ways that serve purposes the raiders cannot observe. The underground community's relationship to the changed surface is one of the most poignant aspects of the game's environmental storytelling. These communities remember a surface that was different. Older members remember it directly. Younger members remember descriptions of it, passed down through accounts that become increasingly distant from lived experience as generations pass. What they remember is a surface that belonged to humans in a way the current surface does not. Not because humans are absent from it. Raiders go up there every session, but because the current surface is oriented towards something else. The conditions it provides, the soil, the atmosphere, the water, the electromagnetic environment, are not optimized for human life. They are optimized for something else. And every generation that grows up in the underground is growing up in a world where the surface, the world above them, is slowly becoming less theirs and more the orbiters. This generational transformation of what the surface means to human communities is documented in the game's lore in ways that are easy to miss if you are not looking for them. The language that older survivors use to describe the surface is filled with memory. They describe specific places, specific qualities of light and air, specific things that are no longer there. The language that younger members of those same communities use to describe the surface is operational. They describe it in terms of resources, routes, threats, and extraction zones. The surface, for the younger generation, is not a lost world. It is a workspace, dangerous, necessary, and fundamentally alien to the life they live underground. The orbiter is the primary agent of this alienation, not just because it threatens human surface presence directly, but because it is continuously transforming the surface into something that is less and less compatible with what human communities need the surface to be. If the transformation continues, if each generation of raiders finds a surface that is slightly more arc-optimized and slightly less human-compatible than the previous generation found, then the long-term trajectory of the world's surface is toward a condition that humans cannot survive in at all. Not killed by a strike, simply unable to live there because the environmental conditions that human life requires have been systematically replaced by something else. The raiders who go to the surface are, in this framing, not just resource gatherers. They are also, in a sense, they probably do not articulate in those terms, witnesses, people who maintain the connection between the underground communities and a surface world that is changing in ways the communities need to track. Every raider who comes back with observations about surface conditions, about where things are different from last time, about new ARC unit behaviors or new environmental anomalies, is contributing to a body of knowledge that tells the underground communities how fast the world above them is changing, and how much time they might have before the question of surface viability is no longer academic. The time dimension of the surface transformation is one of the things the game handles most quietly and most effectively. It does not show you a graphic of the surface's changing condition over time. It does not give you before and after comparisons. What it does is give you a world that feels like it is in the middle of a process, not at the beginning or the end, but somewhere in the progression. And it trusts you to sense the momentum of that process without being told explicitly where it is going. You feel, in the environmental details, that things are moving, that what you are looking at now is different from what was there before, and what will be there later will be different from what is there now. The direction of change is legible, even if its destination is not. The orbiter's relationship to the specific forms that surface transformation takes is not always visible in the direct sense. You cannot watch the orbiter do something and then point to a specific surface change and say that is the result. The transformation is cumulative and distributed, but the correlation between areas of long-duration arc presence and the specific quality of transformation those areas display is consistent enough that researchers in the game's lore have built models of it. These models predict, with some accuracy, what a given surface area will look like after a specified additional period of arc presence, based on current conditions and the intensity of orbiter and ground unit activity in that area. The models are not perfect, but they are accurate enough to be taken seriously as descriptions of a real process. What those models predict, when run forward in time, is a surface that progressively assumes the characteristics of what several researcher documents call an arc-native environment. Not alien in the sense of being unrecognizable as a planetary surface, still sky and ground and some kind of atmosphere, but alien in the sense of being structured around the operational needs of the arc machines rather than the biological needs of Earth's native life. Arc-native environments in the model predictions are not hostile deserts. They are something more specific and more disturbing. They are environments that are actively optimized for arc machine operation in ways that are profoundly indifferent to everything that evolved here. The arc of this trajectory, if the models are right, ends in a surface that the underground communities cannot access even temporarily. Not because it is physically impossible to reach, but because the environmental conditions it presents are incompatible with human presence, without equipment and support systems that are well beyond what current survivor communities can assemble. The surface would still be there. The sky would still be there, with the orbiter in it, doing what the orbiter does. But the humans would be underground permanently, and the connection between the two levels of the world would be severed not by any dramatic event, but by slow accumulation of incompatibility. That ending, quiet and gradual and final, is one of the possibilities the game's lore holds open without committing to. It is not the only possible trajectory. Resistance is possible. Understanding, if achieved, might point toward intervention. The raiders who go to the surface every session are not simply delaying an inevitable outcome. They are, in a real sense, keeping options open that would close if they stopped. As long as humans are going to the surface, as long as they are coming back with knowledge and resources and observations, the underground communities maintain a connection to what is happening above them. And that connection is the precondition for anything else. You cannot understand something you have severed all contact with. You cannot find a way to change something you can no longer reach. The orbiter, viewed from this angle, is not just a threat. It is a timer of a different kind than the one it represents in a match. In a match, it is a timer counting down to a strike. In the larger narrative, it is a timer counting down to the moment when the surface transformation it has been conducting since the invasion reaches a threshold beyond which human surface access becomes impossible. Neither timer can be stopped by any individual action, but the second timer, unlike the first, might be influenced by collective and sustained human response, by the accumulation of understanding and capability in the underground communities, by the raiders who keep going up and coming back and adding to the body of knowledge that might eventually tell someone exactly what needs to be done. The ground units on the surface are, in this larger framing, not the raiders' real problem. They are the immediate operational challenge. The real problem is the process the orbiter is overseeing, the slow transformation of the surface into something that is no longer compatible with human presence. Fighting the ground units is necessary and real and requires skill and courage, but winning against ground units in any given session does not address the process. The process continues regardless of what happens between raiders and ground units in any particular match. The orbiter is not watching those fights. It is doing what it does, and the surface continues to change, and the timer continues to run. To close this chapter, I want to describe one image from the game that captures the relationship between the ground below and the sky above in a way that I find difficult to shake. It is not a dramatic image. It is quiet. In one of the surface environments, in a section that shows evidence of long-duration arc presence, there is a specific quality to the light at a certain time of the match's day-night cycle. The orbiter is visible in the sky. The surface around you is empty. No raiders, no active arc units, just a transformed landscape. And the light from the orbiter touches the surface in a way that illuminates specific details while leaving others in shadow. Damaged structures, changed soil, vegetation that exists exactly where it was allowed to exist, and not 1 meter further. And the orbiter above it all, steady and silent, looking at what it has made. Not looking exactly because we have no evidence the orbiter perceives in any way that deserves that word, but oriented toward it, above it, presiding. Chapter 12. Raiders, Memory, and Resistance. The human beings in Arc Raiders are not abstractions. They are not symbols of resistance or hope in the genre sense. They are people doing what people do when the world they were born into has been fundamentally changed by something they did not choose and cannot undo. They work. They build community. They argue. They grieve. They develop expertise about the new shape of their world and pass that expertise to the next generation. They find meaning in the immediate and the practical because the large and the abstract are too enormous and too unresolvable to live inside of permanently. The Raiders are the most visible expression of all of this, the people who carry the community's need for resources and information on their shoulders every time they go to the surface. But they are not separate from the community that sends them. They are its most active edge. The orbiter is always present in Raider experience, but not always in the foreground of it. Experienced Raiders describe a relationship to the orbiter that is characterized less by fear than by a constant low-level awareness. It is up there. You know it is up there. You know what it does and roughly when it does it. And within that knowledge you operate, doing what you came to the surface to do. With the orbiter in your peripheral awareness, the way a skilled professional keeps background risks in their awareness without allowing those risks to dominate attention that needs to be on the immediate task. This is not bravery in the theatrical sense. It is the practical calibration of attention that extended experience produces. New Raiders have a different relationship to the orbiter. For them, the awareness of it is not yet peripheral. It takes up more space, more mental bandwidth. The first session accounts in the game's Raider documentation describe a specific quality of hyper-awareness about the orbiter during early surface time. Checking it, thinking about it, factoring it into decisions about movement and positioning in ways that experienced Raiders would not need to think about explicitly, because they have internalized the timing and the geography well enough that avoidance behavior happens automatically. The new Raider's conscious relationship with the orbiter is a burden that experienced Raiders have mostly, but not entirely shed. The shedding of conscious orbiter awareness as Raiders gain experience is not universally seen as positive within Raider culture. Several accounts describe experienced Raiders who explicitly cultivate continued conscious awareness of the orbiter rather than allowing it to recede into automaticity. Their argument is that the habituation that experience produces is itself a risk. The orbiter does not follow a perfect schedule. There is variability in its behavior, the adaptive element that analysts identified. A Raider who is too habituated, too confident in their internalized timing, is a Raider who gets caught by a deviation from the expected pattern. Keeping the orbiter consciously present, these experienced Raiders argue, is a form of respect for its unpredictability, not fear. Respect. The distinction they draw is meaningful. The Raider community's oral tradition around the orbiter is something the game preserves in fragments that reveal a culture that has developed specific practices and beliefs around surviving in the orbiter's presence. These are not mystical beliefs in the conventional sense. They are not prayers to the orbiter or rituals to appease it. They are more practical than that, and more interesting for their practicality. Rules of thumb, indicators to watch for, behaviors that experienced Raiders have found correlate with different orbiter activity levels. Some of this oral tradition aligns with what researcher analysis confirms. Some of it is almost certainly coincidence systematized by the human pattern recognition tendency. But all of it represents the community's active effort to understand and navigate the thing in the sky, to build whatever small measure of practical wisdom is possible in relation to an entity that is fundamentally beyond human control. The practices that have developed around extraction specifically are the most elaborate part of this oral tradition. Every experienced raider has an extraction philosophy, a set of principles about how to time and route the movement from wherever they are in the map to the extraction point, calibrated around their understanding of orbiter behavior and their assessment of ground unit positions. These philosophies are not arbitrary. They are the product of experience and observation and the hard lessons that surface operations teach. And they are transmitted, adapted, debated, and refined within raider communities in a process that is, in its small way, a genuine intellectual tradition. The raiders are scholars of the orbiter in the only school that matters, which is the school of getting out alive. The emotional weight of losses to the orbiter within raider communities is different from the emotional weight of losses to ground units. Losses to ground units are processed within a framework of combat. They involve decisions, mistakes, moments where things could have gone differently. They can be analyzed. Lessons can be extracted. The community can ask what happened and receive an answer that, however painful, makes sense within the operational logic of surface missions. Losses to the orbiter are different. They are more absolute. When a raider does not extract in time, there is often no lesson to extract from it. The timing was too close. The route was blocked. Something went wrong that could not have been anticipated in the way a ground unit encounter can be anticipated. The orbiter does not give you a fight. It gives you a deadline, and when the deadline passes and you are still there, the outcome is not a story with a lesson. It is simply an end. The grief that raider communities carry around orbiter losses has a specific quality that comes through in the personal documents that survive. It is not anger. There is no enemy to direct anger toward in any useful way. The orbiter is not malicious in any frame that anger can engage with. It simply does what it does. The grief is closer to the grief of natural disaster loss, the specific pain of something that was not directed at you, but that took someone anyway. But even that framing is not quite right, because natural disasters are random and the orbiter is not random. It follows a process. Your person was in the process's path. And the process continues, indifferent, unchanged. The psychological weight of that indifference is something the game handles carefully in the personal documents of the raider community. People find ways to carry it. They develop frameworks that allow them to hold the loss without being consumed by it. Some of those frameworks are practical, focusing on what can be learned and what can be done differently. Some are social, distributing the weight of the loss across the community so that no one person carries it alone. Some are philosophical in ways that are harder to categorize, ways of understanding the orbiter's indifference that make it livable without making it acceptable. The livability of the orbiter's indifference is what raider culture is partly organized around achieving, because a community that cannot make the orbiter livable cannot send people to the surface. And a community that cannot send people to the surface cannot survive. The intergenerational transmission of raider knowledge and culture is one of the most important processes in the game's world, and the orbiter is central to it. Every generation of raiders that goes to the surface and comes back adds to the body of knowledge that the next generation will train with. Every generation that loses people to the orbiter adds to the emotional record that shapes how the next generation understands what they are going up against. The accumulation of this knowledge across generations is the primary mechanism by which the underground communities maintain their capacity for surface operations. And it is the primary reason why, despite everything the orbiter represents, the raiders continue to go up there. What that accumulated knowledge adds up to is not understanding of the orbiter in the deep sense, it is operational competence within the orbiter's presence. The knowledge tells you how to survive around the orbiter. It does not tell you what the orbiter is, or why it is there, or what it is ultimately going to do. The deep questions remain exactly as unresolved for the generation that has been raiding for 50 years as they were for the generation that first went to the surface after the invasion. More data, no more answers. The operational expertise grows, while the fundamental mystery stays fixed. This combination of growing operational competence and persistent fundamental ignorance is one of the most honest things about the game's treatment of its world. It reflects something true about the human condition in genuinely overwhelming circumstances. People get very good at surviving within a situation they do not understand. They develop remarkable competence within constraints they cannot remove. They build culture and community and meaning inside a frame that was imposed on them by something they had no part in creating. And the thing that imposed the frame remains as opaque as ever, doing what it does, indifferent to the remarkable human project of survival that is being conducted in its shadow. The resistance that raiders represent is real, in the sense that they are doing something against the interest of whatever is imposing the frame. They are surviving when the world that was built for the Ark project would prefer that they not be there. They are gathering resources and building knowledge and maintaining the underground communities that produce the next generation of raiders. They are doing something, but the something they are doing is not, at the scale of the orbiter's operation, a significant disruption. The orbiter has not changed its behavior in response to raider activity. The transformation of the surface continues at its own pace. The missions to something beyond Earth, if that is what the directional emissions represent, continue without interruption. The question of whether raider resistance can ever become strategically significant, whether the combination of knowledge and capability that successive generations are building could someday reach the level at which it could meaningfully challenge the Ark project, is one that the game holds open with characteristic honesty. It does not promise that the raiders are building towards something. It does not guarantee that the knowledge accumulated across generations will eventually produce the insight that changes everything. It shows you people doing what they can, with the tools they have, in the world they were given, and it lets you feel the weight of both the effort and the uncertainty. The orbiter, in this framing, is not just the antagonist of the raiders' operational situation, it is the condition of their identity. The people they are, the culture they have built, the values they hold, are all shaped by the presence of this thing in their sky. A people defined by what they are up against, by the specific shape of the overwhelming thing they survive alongside, develop a character that is different from any other character that different circumstances would have produced. The raiders are who they are because the orbiter is what it is. And the orbiter is what it is without any knowledge of or interest in what it has made of the people below it. The relationship is entirely one-directional. The raiders are shaped by the orbiter. The orbiter is not shaped by the raiders. That asymmetry is the fundamental condition of Ark Raiders' world. It is not a world of balanced conflict, where the two sides press against each other with comparable force. It is a world where one side is so far beyond the other in scale and capability that the concept of balance does not apply. What applies instead is endurance, the capacity of the smaller side to continue existing in the presence of something that is not trying to destroy it specifically, but that makes existence difficult as a byproduct of doing what it does. The raiders are not fighting a war they can win in the conventional sense. They are maintaining a presence in a world that is being reshaped around them. And the maintenance of that presence is its own form of victory, even if it never looks like victory in any frame the orbiter would recognize. To close this chapter, I want to sit with one specific category of raider account that appears in the game's documentation, and that I have been saving for this point because it requires everything that came before to be fully legible. These are the accounts of raiders who have been on the surface long enough and often enough that they describe what they can only call a relationship with the orbiter, not a relationship in any interpersonal sense, not affection or connection or communication, but a familiarity that goes beyond operational knowledge, a quality of knowing something the way you know a significant feature of a landscape you have spent years in, the way a fisherman knows the sea, not understanding it, not controlling it, but having been in its presence long enough that it has become part of the texture of your experience in a way that cannot be undone.